Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee on building support for the energy transition. Welcome to our first panel from a combination of Ofgem and Ofcom, and if you can introduce yourselves please, starting on this side.
Hi everyone, I'm Priya Brahmbhatt-Patel. I'm the Exec Director of Communications and Engagement at Ofgem.
I'm Neil Kenward, the Executive Director for Strategy, Economics, Research and Net Zero at Ofgem.
Hello, I'm Macrae, Director of Market Intelligence at Ofcom.
And I'm Rhea. I am the Director of Content Standards at Ofcom.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us and for your patience as we were somewhat delayed this afternoon. And I'll ask the first set of questions. Now, these are to Ofcom. You accept that climate science is settled, and indeed that's very much in your remit. But given that you say it's settled, aren't you overly cautious in the way you regulate and in the way you approach the broadcasters? And as a result, we rarely see regulatory action.
I thought it might be helpful just to very briefly set out to the committee our processes for regulating broadcasters. So Ofcom's a post-broadcast regulator, and Parliament gave us powers to protect audiences from a range of harms, such as protecting children from content which is unsuitable for them, protecting audiences from things like hate speech or material that incites crime, and preserving due accuracy and due impartiality in news. And these are distilled into our broadcasting code, which is a set of rules that our broadcasters must comply with. So when we receive a complaint to Ofcom, we will fully assess it and see whether it raises substantive issues warranting investigation under the code. In doing that, we will take into account the full context in which that content was broadcast, and also have regard to a broadcaster's right to freedom of expression and the audience's right to freedom of expression. If we find issues that are substantive, we will launch an investigation, and the outcomes of those are published on our website. And if we find a broadcaster in breach, then we will set out the full reasons for doing so. I think probably most relevant to this discussion are our rules on due accuracy and due impartiality in news. And when it comes to non-news programmes, that factual programmes and factual matters don't materially mislead the audience. You referred to the guidance that we gave around anthropogenic climate change, and that was a specific part of our guidance to help broadcasters understand how they could comply with our rules on due impartiality. Due is a really important qualification when it comes to impartiality. It's a flexible concept. It does not mean that every argument or every facet of every argument has to be represented. But what this does is recognise that where there's a broadly established scientific or evidential consensus, such as with anthropogenic climate change, that broadcasters aren't required to treat that consensus as if it's still a matter of contention or debate, with the heightened due impartiality requirements, and that ensures that our regulatory approach is fair and proportionate.
Sorry to stop you, Laura. Did you just say that broadcasters are required to treat it as if it is a matter of debate or not?
No, they do not have to treat it as a matter that is still contentious or a matter of debate on the science. Having said that, we are aware that there are many issues that broadcasters may wish to scrutinise around climate change and around net zero, for example, government policies, the efficacy of those policies, international governments' approaches to climate change. And broadcasters have the editorial freedom to do that and to explore those things robustly, including platforming different views and sometimes contentious views, so long as they comply with our rules. So this is not about shutting down debate.
Right, well thank you for your explanation. According to the DESNE's Public Attitudes Tracker in 2025, 1,221 Ofcom complaints have been made about climate misinformation between 2020 and 25. None resulted in upheld breach on climate coverage. Are you telling me that they all qualify for sitting outside the principles that you just set out?
So you're right, since 2020 we have had that number of complaints on climate change related issues. Just for a bit of context, we received 50,000 complaints last year alone, so that just gives you an indication on the numbers. Yes, every complaint we receive into Ofcom is fully assessed. We look at the full context in which that complaint about content was broadcast, and we make a determination whether it warrants investigation. The fact that there have been no recent investigations, I think, probably speaks to the fact that broadcasters that we regulate have a good understanding of the code and that they are complying broadly with our rules.
All 1,221 of those complaints complied with the rules?
They were assessed and they were not seen to warrant further investigation.
Okay. And you're happy that you have the authority to act within the current arrangements?
Yes, so we feel that we have that the powers that we've been given in the broadcast space and the code that derives from them gives us sufficient flexibility, but also a robust set of rules to which we can hold broadcasters to account.
Thank you. And I think my colleagues have got some follow-up questions on this, but we've had evidence. I think Roger Harabin was saying to us recently that mainstream reporting and commentary varies significantly and has a profound effect on the view of the public about the energy transition. How do you respond to what Roger told us?
Well, I think we recognise that political debate may be moving and that broadcasters may wish to explore a range of views on that and the richness of that debate. Consistent with freedom of expression, broadcasters have the editorial freedom to explore those things as long as they comply with our rules. As I said, the code is suitably flexible for us to adapt our rules accordingly, but we feel that they are good guardrails while preserving editorial freedoms for broadcasters, but also making sure that they comply so that news is duly accurate and non-news programmes do not materially mislead the audience so as to cause harm.
Yeah, you said in your opening statement that there is a degree of judgment which is exercised by the broadcaster and indeed by you. Is there a danger that judgment is flawed?
We are the expert regulator. We regulate complaints over a broad range of issues. We have deep expertise in this area. Where we find breaches, we set out our full reasoning for doing so. That broadcasters, it is important that broadcasters do have editorial freedom and can exercise their right to freedom of expression, and indeed that audiences receive a range of views and ideas. And I think that that both broadcasters understand our rules, and I think that we apply them consistently, rigorously and fairly.
Okay, well, thank you. We will pursue this further with Mike Reader.
Thank you, Chair. What we've just heard from you, Laura, is that Ofcom's regulatory approach is wait for a complaint. Is that effective regulation in the current media environment?
Well, we're a post-broadcast regulator, so we have no powers to intervene before broadcast, but on receipt of a complaint, as I have said, we will fully assess it and the context in which it was broadcast. As I've already said, we had 50,000 complaints last year, 24 investigations were launched, we found 15 broadcasters in breach. We can, if we feel it's proportionate and necessary we can sometimes carry out monitoring of broadcasters if we feel it is proportionate and necessary to do so. But as a post-broadcast regulator, we can only really consider complaints about specific programmes, each one on a case-by-case basis, so we don't...
You're post-broadcast, but you have to wait for a complaint before you can review. You're not proactively reviewing post-broadcast, particularly where there are outlets such as GB News, which are very clearly biased in one direction or another.
So what I would say to that is, as our role isn't to investigate the editorial approach or editorial policy of a broadcaster or broadcasters towards any particular issue. Again, as I said, this goes back to a broadcaster's right to editorial freedom, and that's consistent with their rights to freedom of expression. That's absolutely central to our consideration. And they can explore a range of views and contentious views as long as they comply with our code. But if we find that the broadcaster is in breach of our code, that breach is noted on their compliance record. And where we find that there is a serious, deliberate or repeated or reckless breach, we can, if we think it's consider it proportionate, impose a statutory sanction, and we'll take the compliance record into account when we consider that.
Our inquiry has clearly heard that there is a drop in trust in the media and what some would call mainstream media. Do you think Ofcom has been effective in the regulator to support trust in the media? Surely that is one of the key functions of a regulator, is to maintain trust in the services that it regulates.
So I think trust in news is a really important issue, and it's something that Ofcom takes incredibly seriously. As you will know, that we have, but I mean, it's interesting, and I might be able to pass to Ian here slightly, because we know that actually when it comes, while people are consuming news from many different sources, one of the things that our news consumption survey found, for example, is that there is still very high trust in broadcast news. And one of the things that we are actively looking at, for example, and we've suggested in our public service media review, is that that public service broadcast news should probably be given prominence on something such as YouTube, and we've made that recommendation. So I think, yes, I mean, Ian might have more to say about public trust in news, but I think public trust in broadcast news still remains consistently high.
Yeah, so we track this on an annual basis, and around 7 in 10 adults say they find broadcast news trustworthy. If you look at news on social media, that falls to 4 in 10. So people have different expectations of content that's on broadcast and on online. And again, you've got sort of similar metrics if you look at the accuracy of news and impartiality of news.
So we have seen in the past year a loss of political consensus around the delivery of the Climate Change Act and reaching net zero by 2050, particularly with the policy U-turn from the Conservative Party. How does that affect Ofcom's application of due impartiality on broadcast debates on these issues?
Well, we recognise that political debate may move and change, and our code is sufficiently flexible to deal with that. As with all areas of political debate, there is editorial choice for broadcasters about what they cover and how and who they invite onto programmes to discuss it. But I think that our code is sufficiently flexible that we can move with political consensus as it evolves and develops.
And my final question: you have received a high number of high-profile complaints regarding the lack of impartiality in GB News' recent broadcast of interview with President Trump. Mm-hmm. Can you update us on your assessment of whether the case requires investigation?
So we have received complaints, as you know, about that programme. That is currently under assessment, which is, as I discussed, going through that due process. Unfortunately, I can't really comment further because we have to follow due process at this stage, but we will be publishing the outcome of our decision, and we'd be very happy to follow up with the committee later and let you know the outcome of that decision.
Rich, I'll ask just one more. So how long does that process take? Someone's made a complaint, you're now in an assessment, you just got to watch the programme and make a decision. So how long do you take to make that assessment?
Well, that can vary depending on the nature of the programme.
So in the case of this case, how long will it take you to make a decision?
It will take us as long as it needs to take to make sure that we have done a rigorous assessment and we have looked at all the facts and all the contextual analysis, and also to look at all the complaints that we've received to see what they are raising to us and make sure that we have done a thorough assessment before we decide.
Typically, is that weeks, months?
It is very much on a case-by-case basis. We try and work as quickly, but we also have to do due diligence, and we have to follow due process, and we have to make sure that our assessment decisions are rigorous.
Your assessment of this case, what do you roughly think? Are we talking a few months? Are we talking a year?
I can't put a timeline on that in real time at the moment, I'm afraid, because I've got an expert team looking at that particular case at the moment. But as I say, once we have made a determination on that, we're very happy to come back to the committee and update you.
Thanks. In France, C News was fined €20,000 when a speaker on one of its programmes said climate change was a lie, a scam. The Ofcom, the French regulator, has found 4 broadcasting code breaches related to the climate crisis in the last 2 years. Your broadcasting code says factual programmes must not mislead the audience. Why is there a difference is there a difference in the assessment being made in France?
Well, I can't speak for the French regulator, but of course, I think we are always keep across what other regulators do in the broadcasting space. But I think, often other regulators in other countries are working in different political, social, and broadcasting contexts, so it's difficult to compare like for like. But I think, to your point, I think it's important. I think that we have done our processes rigorously and fairly, and I don't think there's particularly that speaks to a disconnect.
There are people in this country who've gone on broadcast media and called climate science a lie or a scam or both. Have you had complaints about those?
Well, if we have had complaints, we will assess them thoroughly. Quite possibly we will have had complaints about those programmes.
What complaints have you had about climate science broadcasting?
We get a range of complaints about climate change and the science, and also about various issues and political issues, policy issues around climate change, and we will assess those.
Can you give us some examples?
I can't, at this particular moment in real time, give examples, and the reason for that is that the ones that most likely come to mind might be cases that are still under assessment, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to do so. But if you'd like a range of examples of cases that we've closed, I'm sure that we can provide this to the committee.
That would be a good idea, yes. It's a shame you didn't come to the committee with some of those, seeing as you knew what we were going to be asking you, isn't it?
I apologise for that.
Could I just
Polly.
follow up? Do you have at least a categorisation of them so that we've got ones which are people complaining because they challenge the science, the people who are complaining challenge the science and think that it's been biased because they are assuming that the reporting is reporting the science without any challenge? Or do you have the other way around? I mean, I would have thought you'd be categorising and tagging your complaints into different approaches. We look at the substance of every complaint that we receive. We don't necessarily publish aggregated data or categorise complaints by topic necessarily. We are transparent about our regulatory decisions. We publish the outcome of our standards investigations, and we also publish a list of programmes we receive where we receive more than 50 standards complaints weekly. So we try and be as transparent as possible. More broadly, we do sometimes publish high-level information about complaints volumes and themes in our annual reports. That's another way that we try and be transparent about that. And one thing I would say, though, is that number of complaints doesn't necessarily indicate that there's been a breach of our rules. A high level of complaints doesn't always indicate that there's been a breach, and a low level of complaints or just a few complaints doesn't necessarily... No, I'm aware of that. It's just I'm just interested to understand how you keep an eye on where the trends might be in complaints and bearing in mind this is increasingly, there is some polarisation about this debate, whether the science is settled or not. So I'm just interested to understand how you are measuring the dynamics of that debate through the nature of the complaints.
So we have a broad understanding of that, and we do look at the type of complaints that we receive, the nature of that, and we do sort of track that through. So we do have a broad understanding. We keep across a whole number, as you could imagine, of policy areas where there may be debate and so on, and that's part of our role. So we do keep across that, but we maybe not have something completely measurable.
It just seems that you've probably got the data that you could do it. So it seems odd that you don't. But I mean, look, I'll just be for full transparency. As a journalist at the BBC, a long time ago, before we had any of this kind of clever data tagging or whatever, I could access the complaints data and see and search
and say, right, last night there were X number of complaints about Y issue, and I could then measure that against what it had been like the last time we were reported on that.
We can do that. Sorry.
So that kind of tagging and aggregation would be useful, bearing in mind some people are going to be saying, why have you got those greenies on, banging on about this and it's all a lie, versus other people saying, why are you allowing those people on who are just completely denying the science?
So we have a team that look at complaints and track through complaints, so they can see the types of complaints we're receiving, the nature of those complaints, the number of those complaints. So it does give us a broad indication of how that works. So we can do that, and we can do that on a whole host of issues, as you can appreciate. But we have 50,000 complaints last year, and that is quite low for the number of complaints year on year. So there's a lot of data there. But yes, we do track that through, so we do have an understanding.
Can you just tell me, what preparation did you do to come to this session?
Well, quite a bit. We did quite. I'm very happy to follow up further in writing if there's anything you think is missing from my evidence today. Yes, we did do quite a lot of preparation ahead of this.
Okay, well, you haven't told me what.
Well.
Never mind, we will move on.
I'm wondering, Chair, if I could come in now with some of the thoughts I had rather than later down the agenda. Is that okay? So we've heard that Ofcom are obviously a post-broadcast regulator and is a complaints-led regulator. So you have to wait until there has been complaints about broadcast media, and I think we understand that very clearly. Given that there have been complaints about content relating to climate change and energy, but there has been very little in terms of regulatory enforcement, therefore, those complaints have not been upheld. Do you think that the complaints-led model provides deterrence to broadcasters from breaching your code? Because you are regulating against the code, yeah?
Yeah.
And from my perspective, I'm not seeing an awful lot of deterrence for broadcasters from broadcasting whatever they like, whether it breaches the code or not, if there's not strong enforcement. So firstly, do you think the current complaints-led model provides that deterrence? Yes or no?
Yes, I think it does.
And how does it do that?
It does that because we find a broadcaster in breach, we give full reasons for doing that. We publish that on our website. It's fully transparent. It's noted on a broadcaster's compliance record that there's been a breach. And if we find that there has been, as I said previously, serious, deliberate, repeated or reckless breaches of the code by a broadcaster, then we may decide it is appropriate to impose a statutory sanction. There's a range of sanctions at Ofcom's disposal to do that. That ranges from saying to a broadcaster they have to broadcast a statement of our findings and not repeat the programme, through to financial penalties, and the strongest sanction that we can give is to revoke a broadcasting licence.
And how many times, I can see that there's a range of penalties and that seems perfectly appropriate. Mm-hmm. How many times has any regulatory enforcement action been taken in regards to climate change or energy in the last year or 5 years?
So I think there have only been 2 breaches which we've given full details of to the committee already, but that doesn't mean that we are not regulating appropriately. I think that the broadcasters have a really strong understanding of our rules, and we have to be fair and proportionate. We are consistent in our application of our rules, and we think that they are sufficiently robust. We think that broadcasters, there is a deterrent for broadcasters. Many of them don't want to be in breach of the code. Many of them do want to comply with our rules, and we think that we strike an appropriate balance between enforcing rules to protect audiences from harm, which is the central premise of the code, while at the same time enabling broadcasters to have freedom and the freedom to debate important political matters, which of course is important for democracy and more broadly.
And I think absolutely the committee understands the need to do that. Now we've heard that you understand the broad themes of the complaints that you receive as a regulator, but Ofcom doesn't routinely publish aggregated analysis of complaint trends relating specifically to climate or energy content. In fact, I don't actually know if you publish them for any subject. Should you?
I don't necessarily think we should, but I think that we feel that we're really transparent about the data that we do publish. We think that it's a good indication of where we are, our regulatory approach. We always try and be transparent about the work that we do, but I think publishing complaints necessarily by topic is quite a vast job, I would suggest.
Could you explain to the committee then what you do publish? You're saying you're transparent about how you regulate. Mm-hmm. Can you please tell the committee what it is that you do put in the public domain that is therefore available to analyse? So
we publish the outcomes of all our broadcast standards investigations. They go in a fortnightly broadcast and on-demand bulletin. That's published on our website. We also publish a list of programmes that receive more than 50 standards complaints a week on a weekly basis. We don't include fairness and privacy in those for obvious reasons perhaps, but and as I said before, we do publish high-level information about complaints volumes, themes in our annual report, number of complaints in our annual report. Sometimes we will, which will give a broad indication of where audiences' concerns lie, and I think that's quite indicative, perhaps, of the kind of complaints that we receive.
Okay, I think Graham Downey wasn't very impressed with your answers, so he's going to ask a follow-up.
Just very briefly, you said that many broadcasters want to comply. Which ones don't want to comply, and what do you do about them? I mean, you're laughing and implying that you know that some don't. What do you do with them? You've said you've used the word transparent many times, and yet through questions from various members of the committees, you don't publish lots of data routinely. You don't tag it in the way that, frankly, I would expect. How is that transparent? Quite the opposite. That is incredibly opaque. You're asking us to trust that you know what you're doing without publishing the data.
So, I mean, we feel that we are transparent, and I'm very happy to take away your concerns. I mean, you know, I'm sorry if you don't feel that the answer that I've given is sufficient, but I think...
I don't think what you just said fits with our understanding of the definition of the word transparent, I'm afraid.
Well,
have matters like this that we're asking for data to be published, has that been considered at any level inside Ofcom that actually we should be publishing this data regularly? We are a regulator. We should be telling people what it is we're regulating and how we're doing it. Has that even been considered by Ofcom?
I mean, we do consider how we account for how we regulate broadcasters. Of course we do. We take it incredibly seriously, and we try and be as transparent as possible about
what is it that's stopping you being transparent? Say transparent as possible. What is it that's stopping you being more transparent?
I think it's... Look, I'm very happy to take that away and follow up with the committee in writing about whether there is more that we could put into the public domain about our data. But I think broadly that we do try and be as transparent as possible and very accountable, and I absolutely stick to that. I think that's the way that Ofcom has always operated, is to be as transparent about our broadcasting regime as possible. And I think that broadcasters do broadly understand our rules. They do comply with our rules. Where we find that they fall short, we will be rigorous in our regulation of that, and we will follow up with our rules accordingly.
Can I just say, Laura said that all programmes where we receive more than 50 complaints, we publish data about the number of complaints for those programmes. We also publish full details about investigations we open and when we decide not to open an investigation, and details about the decision that we make. So, I mean, that feels quite transparent to me. It's a little bit outside my area of expertise, but...
My sense is people watching this might think that you've just said you're as transparent as possible whilst publishing very little. Lizzie Collins.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is when we're talking about an individual instance or an individual complaint, you publish a certain amount of data about it. But what we're not seeing is an ability for either us as elected representatives or a member of the public to go and see what the trends are in terms of what people are complaining about, what the problem could be, and we know that numbers of complaints don't necessarily match with breaches of the code, we understand that, but we're not able to go in and interrogate the work of Ofcom at a higher level, and we're unable to see at a glance what the public's concerns are. So if, for example, you did publish aggregated analysis of complaint trends specifically to climate change and energy, which is our remit here, then we could go on and go, well, we can see what the public is concerned about. We can see what the issues are from a public perspective, and we can then see what the regulator's response is. But we don't have that whole picture, is what I'm hearing. Thanks, Chair.
Christopher Chope has been waiting.
Can I just try and bring some balance to this? Because I think it seems to me as though the sort of the prosecuting authorities for the net zero zealots are having a go at Ofcom, and yet I would like to suggest that Ofcom is actually probably erring in not bringing to book those people who are broadcasting net zero zealotry. And taking it as an example, the relative lack of broadcasting time given to the report 2 days ago from the Institute of Economic Affairs, which says that the overall costs of net zero have been massively underestimated and are now thought to be about £9 trillion. 9 million pounds by 2050, far in excess of anything put forward by the Climate Change Committee and other commentators. There's been very little of that in certain parts of the media, and it seems from the line of questioning that people who don't like GB News because they think it supports is supportive of reform and the Conservative Party, they are trying to use Ofcom as a means of attacking GB News. So I'm on the side of Ofcom because I think you're doing an excellent job in trying to maintain balance. And I wouldn't accept any of the accusations that have been made against you.
Be wary of your allies, Ofcom.
I'm not sure there was a question there, but anyway.
Can I just come back on one thing, which was about the data that we publish, which is just to say that everything that we do put in the public domain, so in terms of our complaints determinations, etc., are searchable on our website, and they're searchable by code rules and also by broadcasters. So there is a search mechanism for people to go in and look at that data and to search it themselves. So just to clarify that, so you can go onto the Ofcom website and look at the complaints and look at the rules that we've and the broadcasters, and so it will give a nature of the complaint.
That is very good to hear, Chair. I still am not convinced that the amount of data that is available to us is sufficient.
Right.
Thank you.
Polly Brillington, you indicated you had another question.
My point, I think, has somewhat been lost and distracted, unfortunately, and I'm sure we've got what we need.
Great, thank you. Claire Young.
Yes, so thank you, Chair. We've had a number of submissions to this inquiry that have raised online misinformation as a major barrier to building support for the net zero transition. And your own research shows that 4 in 10 UK adults say they've recently encountered misinformation or deepfake content, mostly online. We're seeing a growing policy discussion about media literacy initiatives. Is media literacy just becoming a substitute for regulation where you either lack the powers to act or just don't want to?
I can talk to that. So, I mean, firstly, the Online Safety Act, its primary purpose is to prevent the spread of illegal content online and protect children against content that's harmful to them. So mis and disinformation is not a listed harm under the Online Safety Act. So unless it falls under a specific illegal harm, for example, if misinformation is state-sponsored, it might fall under a foreign interference regime. Under the Online Safety Act and the specific harms, there's no rules on platforms, but I would clarify a couple of things, and I'll come to media literacy in a moment. Firstly, transparency requirements under the Online Safety Act mean that platforms are required to comply to their own terms of service, and many of them do have terms of service that relate to disinformation. And that relates, I'm saying that because that relates to our media literacy powers. So Parliament made a decision not to have misinformation, disinformation as a specific harm within the Online Safety Act, but it did acknowledge that misinformation and disinformation is an issue that Ofcom should be charged with responsibilities for. So that was a clarification of our media literacy duties. And so what we do there in relation to media literacy is we've set out a strategy with 3 pillars. Very briefly, research and evaluation is one of them. People and partnerships. We have 700 organisations that we work with across the UK to work out, to build our research and evidence base and reach agreement on what works. And then thirdly and critically, because Ofcom is very well positioned for this, engaging with online platforms in what they're doing in relation to media literacy. And I sort of say that so media literacy is a fundamental part of our regulatory toolkit for tackling disinformation. It's also complementary to some of the work that we do under the Online Safety Act. For example, user empowerment tools, content control tools are a critical way in which platforms can keep their users safe online. When we write the codes of practice for illegal content and for protection of children, what's good practice there is set out as mitigations that platforms can use to protect their users from harmful content. A lot of those mitigations are similar to those used for disinformation. And so, for example, we have published a piece of work in 2024 that was setting out best practice principles for delivering media literacy online. And we've had 5 platforms so far that have signed up to those principles, which are in relation to how information should be shared and provided and how users can be protected. That includes Google, it includes TikTok. So using those media literacy powers, albeit they are a bit softer than the sort of the hard powers related to illegal harms, is having an impact.
What measurable outcomes? I mean, it sounds like you've got a lot of people working on it, but what measurable outcomes should Parliament expect from these initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, firstly,
specifically in relation to the energy transition.
Yeah, okay. Specific to the energy transition. Firstly, we haven't got a lot of people working on it, and so that's why one of our sort of key objectives is to sort of work with. There's a lot of people in the UK generally working in media literacy, so we have a really important role in convening and sharing research, in working out what works best. I mean, as far as we evaluate what's working, when we published our media literacy strategy with those 3 pillars, each of those pillars has got outcomes that we are targeting achieving. So there's 3 umbrella outcomes for each of those pillars. Underneath that, we've got 14 sort of measurable outcomes. We can share the details with you later. It's a 3-year plan. We've got a mid-term evaluation piece that's coming out in the summer this year, and then the full evaluation will be in September 2027. Has that answered your question?
Yes, I think so. So what further legislative powers and resources would Ofcom need to effectively regulate misleading information online regarding the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, we use the powers that are available to us, and I mean, one thing that I should say is that the kind of
other powers would you like?
So, yeah, I mean, we know there's a lot of misinformation online. We have research. You mentioned the 40% of adults have seen information that have seen misinformation. It's around 4% of those 40% say the misinformation relates to climate change. But the sort of the corollary, if you like, to having a whole load of, frankly, misinformation and rubbish out there is that people have access to trusted news and information. And so in relation to the powers that we've asked for under the Public Service Media Review, one thing that we have recommended to government is that public service broadcasters, that their news service are given due prominence on YouTube and other video service platforms. So I think that is a sort of a meaningful way of addressing online misinformation online is to make sure that trusted news providers has due prominence online.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want to go on to questions to Ofgem
Yes,
now?
I shall move on to my questions to Ofgem. So yes. Okay, so obviously we've seen the massive impact that the energy crisis had on people. Ofgem's mandate includes protecting consumers and facilitating net zero at least cost. So how does, and this is probably a question for Neil to start with, how does Ofgem balance these objectives when they pull in different directions? For example, investing in low carbon infrastructure versus protecting consumers from short-term price increases?
Absolutely. So we have, as you've mentioned, a range of duties, statutory duties, that are essentially our objectives, but we have one that is the principal objective, which is protecting the interests of consumers, energy consumers, in the long and the short run. Now, since 2010, that principal objective has included the interests of those consumers in the reduction in greenhouse gases, and that was strengthened in 2023 by the previous government, who redefined that to be a net zero duty. So, as you say, we have a net zero duty and that obligation to consumers. And the way our board, Gemma, make these big decisions is they are obviously informed by stakeholder opinions, which we consult on, we get views, and also the analysis that our in-house economists and analysts do. So they will take into account that full range of evidence. And to be honest, on the big infrastructure decisions, so the ones we are directly responsible for, primarily around network investment, in that space, you have obviously the net zero policy, the framework, the speed of the transition is set by government. And what we need to do in the network space is make sure that we are building the networks to connect the new generation to support increasing demand from electrification, for example. So in a sense, the pace is set by the government of the day, and it's our job to make sure that the networks try and keep up with that and ensure we have a proper, safe, secure, reliable sector at least cost. And that's where the Ofgem, as you say, we've got our regulatory mechanisms, and because of the certainty around those, we can unlock tens of billions of pounds of investment in networks and deliver that at a low cost of capital, so at least cost to consumers recovered over decades in this case.
So, can you give examples of how Ofgem has tried to communicate these trade-offs to the public?
Yeah, so I think we always start from a point of what is it that consumers are going to want to engage with, and what will they understand, and how do we make sure that they understand the benefits of what we're saying. So whenever we talk about any of the regulatory changes, we try and make sure that we simplify that message so that we're using plain English, for example. We've done a lot of work, and we've had a lot of feedback actually that suggests quite a lot of the things we publish are quite technical, and some of them have to be by the very nature of them. But on the whole, when we're doing consultations, we're using tools online that make that a much easier process for consumers to engage with. But another big part of how do you make sure trade-offs are understood is engaging with different stakeholder groups. So we make sure that we are speaking regularly to consumer groups, because they are a channel in themselves in terms of speaking directly to consumers. And we want to make sure that when anything that we are doing, we've got to make sure that consumers are going to sources that they trust, that they can engage with and have a conversation with. I think we're looking at how we develop that ourselves. How do we speak directly more to consumers? Do we hold more deliberative events, things like that, where we can actually have that conversation? But at the moment, there are good kind of partners that we work with in order to help have that conversation with consumers directly, because the trade-offs themselves need to be understood in light of the complexity in which we operate. And we have our starting point, as Neil said, is always going to be how are we making sure we're protecting consumers now, but also future consumers? How are we also making sure that we're looking after growth? How are we also making sure that the mandate that government has set forward in terms of decarbonising by 2050 is also balanced? So there are three competing areas, you could say, and we have to be really clear and factual about those in any of the communications that we do. So let's make sure the facts are there, make sure that the information is accessible and available for consumers that might be looking for that information, and make sure we're working with our partners, consumer groups who have that direct access to consumers as well, to help explain what we're doing.
And yet the government has said that consumer trust and satisfaction in the energy market is systematically lower than where it needs to be. So what are you doing to rectify that?
I start on that if you're happy. So absolutely, trust was really taken a blow, I think, from the energy crisis in particular. Trust levels in the energy sector fell to really very low levels. We survey consumers. We do a consumer survey roughly every 6 months to try and track trust and satisfaction levels in the sector and indeed in ourselves. And I'm delighted to say trust levels have been recovering. They remain lower. Trust in the sector in particular remains lower than we'd like to see. But there's an interesting difference. So consumer trust in the industry has recovered, but only to 41%. But consumer satisfaction with their energy supplier is up at a record level of 82%, which is, it dipped strongly during the crisis, as you would expect. But that level of 82% is now higher than before the crisis. So there's work we have been doing, establishing really clear standards, because ultimately a consumer's experience is the thing that counts. And so we have made sure that we've deep dived and put in place good new rules around billing and customer treatment and debt pathways, etc., to make sure that the consumers get the best possible experience. And credit to the sector, they've also risen to that as we've monitored them, and we're getting better consumer satisfaction scores in the sector now.
Do you think you have the powers to do this, or do you think some of this rests with government, or does government need to be giving you more powers?
So in this particular area of consumer service, we have a very strong set of powers. So there's a supply licence that tells energy suppliers what they must do, and we determine the contents of that supply licence. We updated it in light of the crisis, for example, to strengthen the standards, and then we monitor very closely and enforce against those, and we've taken multiple enforcement actions over the last few years to make sure that that message has got through and suppliers are driving up their standards.
Does that help with the competing demands question that I opened the questions with, about how you're communicating those? Do you feel that a lack of remit is inhibiting your ability to communicate that, or do you think that's within your power?
We don't. I'll bring in Priya, but we don't have if you like, our statutory duties don't include an explicit requirement or duty to deliver public messaging specifically. But of course, in delivering our role, as Priya has explained, we make sure we consult very broadly with consumer groups, charities. We consult widely. And we take those views into consideration, and then we try and communicate very clearly the decisions we've made, as Priya was explaining, in language that people can properly understand.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Melanie on.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about customer engagement by Ofgem for vulnerable groups in particular. I hear the point you were saying, Priya, about the meetings with various consumer groups. Who are those groups?
Citizens Advice, National Energy Action. There are specific smaller debt charities that we speak to, and the engagement happens across the board, so from working level through to our board members. We have monthly consumer groups and charity call where different regulatory areas will be talking through kind of the changes that we might be making to regulation, or where we want to introduce new regulation, because I think in the process of developing regulation, the trade-offs...
Sorry, I don't need to...
Oh, sorry.
To.
Okay, sure.
It's interesting though, I mean, you say you're working with organisations like Citizens Advice, that the confidence is improving. What did you say, 82% satisfaction?
Customer satisfaction, yes.
Customer satisfaction rate, and yet Citizens Advice say that regulators and suppliers are out of touch with everyday bill pressures, and explicitly blames Ofgem for failing to act against unfit energy suppliers for nearly a decade, which has as we've recognised, really upset and concerned lots of people, and that vulnerability around the price shocks, leaving people very worried every time they receive an energy bill. Shouldn't relations be more improved than for one of your partners to be saying something so critical of Ofgem? And what do you think that you need to do to improve either on performance so that citizens' advice don't feel the need to do that, or in relationships with citizens' advice?
Yeah, first I should say how we recognise that energy bills have been extremely high, they still remain higher than historic levels, and that huge numbers of households and indeed businesses are facing real struggles. And we have some very robust requirements on suppliers in the way they in particular handle vulnerable households, the way they communicate with them. We published a refreshed vulnerability strategy last year, and it's set out some very clear standards that suppliers need to be meeting in terms of engaging with vulnerable consumers and making sure they understand the vulnerabilities and they can respond, for example, in a crisis to those who need special support. They communicate clearly. So there's a lot of work we do. We talk to citizens' advice an awful lot, and we are always open to feedback on how we can improve what we're doing and how we can...
Do you disagree that you're out of touch, their assessment of you?
So I would say we disagree. So all of the executives have, for example, have calls with actual consumers. They're set up so that we're not just existing in our bubble, our ivory tower, that we are hearing the on-the-ground experience from both householders and business consumers. So we have that direct line as well as talking to these consumer groups on a regular basis. So we are listening.
Because we know that 3/4 of consumers, it doesn't even say that they are vulnerable consumers. All consumers are confused by their energy bills. So the fact that you've released a vulnerability study, presumably you're expecting to see some quite rapid turnaround on 3/4 of people not knowing what their bill means when they open it.
Energy can be complex, we fully understand that. What we require suppliers to do is to provide clearly understandable energy bills as far as possible. Indeed, we have an explainer on our website to try and help consumers understand.
How many consumers do you think go to the Ofgem website?
We have good data on that.
Yeah, so we had 6.5 million between January and October of last year that visited our website. One of the top pages that the top page on our website that's visited is find your supplier. So they want to know who their supplier is. And that's why the licence conditions around the information suppliers have to provide on their bills is so important, and that we are making sure that they are being complied with, because what consumers do is go to the point that they know somebody's going to be able to act to help them, and the supplier is that. And
presumably vulnerability will also include people who don't have access to the internet and will not find it easy to access Ofgem's website.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be worth mentioning that, so we have a campaign which is called Energy Aware. It's not a campaign you'll see on TV or anything like that. It's very much a targeted campaign that looks to reach out to those that don't have high levels of energy literacy, but also don't find it easy to engage with traditional channels like a website. One of the things we did was we took that campaign on a bit of a roadshow. We targeted areas in particular where we know there are high levels of vulnerable consumers that, they just find it easier to speak to people. And that roadshow was aiming to make sure they can understand where they should go to for help. So in a lot
How many stops did that roadshow make?
So there were 8 areas that we identified in the initial cohort of that roadshow. But I think what we also found from that is within vulnerable communities, within the high street, there will be voluntary groups and charities who have a whole range of services that they provide. It's not just restricted to energy. So when a consumer's going to get help, they often have multitudes of issues. So we want to make sure those consumer groups, those charities, have the information they need to help those consumers. So part of our job is to make sure that kind of briefing, collateral, whether it's leaflets or posters, we can provide that to those groups to reach the consumer directly. But that's just one way, and we continue to monitor how effectively our website's being used as well, so we can offer more ways of reaching more vulnerable consumers.
It will only be those who make the effort. You presume there's no way of knowing those who don't.
Yeah, and that's why the ratio was good, because so for example, we would go to a local sort of shopping centre that's not one of the big shopping centres, not like a Westfield or anything, but local shopping centres where
areas
people
like mine don't have a Westfield, so no, I presume it would
exactly,
be a
but
Westfield.
That's the point. It's like high footfall, but of those consumers that we know we're not reaching through traditional channels.
And we know that sort of energy debt charities often work in partnership with food banks, for example. We've visited food banks where there's an energy advisory officer there helping those consumers who may not know where to go, but someone's right there to offer them advice.
I mean, do you think that is sufficient? Do you think that 8 stops on a roadshow is sufficient to reach those communities around the whole of the country that might be experiencing?
I mean, it's not in isolation, so the roadshows are just a part of what can we do as a regulator directly to reach out to consumers. The strength is actually working with Citizens Advice or other consumer groups who have mandates to particularly act on behalf of those consumers. Some Citizens Advice has a statutory duty to do that. So on some of these things, it's better for us to work in partnership with those that we know can reach them in a better way than we can.
It's a broad ecosystem of which we're just one part.
Yeah, and just my final point, Jo, is that Utilita has provided us with some evidence through the course of our inquiry that says the regulator's current approach to regulation overly focuses on prescriptive processes rather than consumer outcomes. I'm interested to know whether you think that's the case and why they're wrong if you disagree. The regular approach of identifying a problem too late, being as vocal as possible to show activity and then taking a combative approach to penalising suppliers isn't conducive to trust, collaboration or better customer outcomes. Where are they wrong? And is there any element of that you think is a fair assessment and you're working to improve that and acknowledging that there are always areas to improve?
So I would acknowledge areas to improve for sure. I think there is a valid critique that some of the rules now are very prescriptive and very detailed and can be quite hard for suppliers to follow, adhere to, whatever. And we consulted last year on moving towards a more outcomes-based form of regulation that really focuses on what consumers really need, what they really want, being clear on the metrics for that, us monitor that really closely, and then we can hold suppliers to account in a different way that gives the suppliers perhaps a little more autonomy, but they still have to deliver ideally even better standards for consumers. And on the latter point around how we hold suppliers to account, I'm unapologetic about the fact that we're sometimes robust in protecting consumers.
And just on the, if I may, on the visibility, like just doing this just to show that we're saying and doing something rather than it actually resulting in something. I mean, I think the satisfaction figures show that where we have had to be prescriptive, and customer service is one of those areas where we probably have had to be prescriptive, like make sure you pick up your phone within a certain amount of time to a consumer. So satisfaction levels were 74% back in January 2025, and they are tracking upwards. And so sometimes a level of prescription might be necessary in order to drive those results. But actually the conversations that we want to have with industry, so we speak to consumer groups and charities, we also speak to trade bodies that represent the sector and represent suppliers. And part of that conversation is we want to free things up, but you've got to work with us to make sure that you're still delivering on the outcomes for consumers. And so, as Neil said, a lot of our work is in terms of kind of the market reforms is around how do we have a more outcomes-based system rather than being overly prescriptive.
Mike Reader.
This may not be a question, Chair. I just wanted to clarify something with Ian, if that's okay. I think you said 40% of adults, which is in your evidences, have experienced misinformation and deep fakes. But it was only 4% that have experienced misinformation and deep fakes related to climate and energy. Was that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's annual research that we do.
Thank you. So that's about 2 million people in the UK. So in Ofgem's responsibility for protecting consumers, what are you doing to protect people that receive misinformation and deep fakes about climate and energy, which is in your remit? Could you give us specific things you're doing in that area?
I mean, so I think, so when it comes to climate policy, it's absolutely for government to set the climate policy, and where we talk about misinformation and disinformation, we do it within the remit of protecting consumers and making sure that that is how we are talking to them.
What do you do? What specific things have Ofgem put in place to protect consumers from misinformation and deepfakes on the online space?
So in terms of misinformation, we make sure that any information we put out there, whether it's through the media, whether it's through our website, whether it's through our consultations, is factual, it's clear, it's transparent. One of the things that we have found, which I think is one of the benefits of large language models coming into the fray, is so where people are familiar with SEO search, what we're finding is GEO search, which large language models will use. So whenever you Google something, you'll get like an AI summary up front. So we're finding that the large language models are using the information that organisations like Ofgem, public sector organisations where you know the information is trusted, that we are operating within a set of rules in statute, those models are searching based on information we're providing versus, say, search in media. So I guess what I'm saying is if we are providing the factual information, and one of the first things consumers are finding when there is a lot of misinformation out there is
the
that
protection for consumers from misinformation, 2 million people, that roughly works out as 4% of the adult population, is making sure your own information is correct. But are you doing anything specifically to tackle deepfakes and misinformation in the online space?
So if we are specifically tagged, if Ofgem its name comes up, then we will absolutely go back to correct that misinformation, or if there is something that we're seeing in the media that is not true, we will make sure we're rebutting it. We won't actively be policing all conversations around this, but where we're alerted and flagged to it, yes, we would correct it.
Is that because it's out of your remit as a regulator?
It's not part of our statutory duties to play that role.
Protect consumers.
Protecting consumers is at the heart of our duties, and we focus our communications around our activities, our regulatory role, and the consumer protections, consumer education around those critical issues. We're always up for considering where we should be doing more. We have, for example, begun a new consumer survey to understand consumer attitudes towards net zero, their attitude to adopting heat pumps, EVs, for example, their experience of that, any barriers that are holding them back. And we're soon to publish the results of the first of those surveys, and that very much informs then how we take our regulatory approach forwards.
So just to clarify, because this inquiry we're doing is about building support for the energy transition, we have one regulator that waits for a complaint before it investigates, a second regulator that doesn't regulate or support consumers in the online space, apart from the information that you've rightly described you put out. So my question is, do you think there's a gap here in regulation and protection of consumers? It's a question for both organisations, that no one actually is protecting consumers online from the growing threat of misinformation and deepfakes in this space, and particularly in the climate discussion. I'll start with Ofgem and then keen to hear from Ofcom.
I think there is a bigger policy question here as well. So I think there is something, if that is what a regulator is now intended to become, then that's a bigger question for those that we are accountable to consider. But within the remit that we have at the moment, so anything to do with Ofgem and our regulation and...
Sorry to interrupt you, that sounds like you're accepting Mike's question.
This in the same way that consumer advice is an ecosystem, this is also an ecosystem, and we focus on where we think we can add most value. Limited resources, we'll focus on the communications around our decisions and protecting consumers in their energy consumption. We do, as I say, we're getting more and more into the net zero space in reflection of our net zero duty, and there may be opportunities to do more in this space going forwards.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, is misinformation online a problem? Of course it is. Our research tells us that that's the case. Are the regulatory tools there in order to address it? Partly, but it's a really complicated picture. I mean, we haven't spoken at all about freedom of expression. It's there on the first page, in the first paragraph actually of the Online Safety Act, that as well as protecting users from harms, it's our duty to ensure that users' rights to freedom of expression are protected. And so that's, when we're looking at misinformation, that's kind of the lens that we're looking through. So, I mean, I might come back to that point of, I think it's unlikely that we're going to be able to stop people from accessing misinformation online. it's really important that trusted, credible news sources are available online and have prominence. But actually the good news as well is that people do have much higher trust in when they're accessing a news organisation that they know and recognise, particularly public service broadcasters. Their trust in that information is much higher than when they access news from unprovenanced sources on social media.
Thank you. Lizzie.
So I just wanted to go back to this idea of where information comes from, the sources. And you said that search engines that use large language models are pulling from your sources. How do you know that? How are you testing that? It's quite clear in other arenas that large language models, even if they link to a source, don't actually necessarily accurately reflect what is on that source and can just invent things. So how do you test and how do you know that that is the case? And further to that, younger people may not use search engines, text-based search engines, may use other platforms like YouTube, TikTok, things like that. Do you do any testing of what information is there within your remit? So, for example, if people search for energy bills or energy suppliers, please can you talk to me about those?
Yeah, so we have the analytics behind our website, which will help us understand who's searching for what, where, and how much search is being derived from consumers that are organically coming to the website versus those that are being directed through other sources. And then in terms of the large language model, so it's a new area that we've recently discovered that this is happening, actually, that these models are finding our information. So there's always a link. Whenever that information is found, there's always a link which directs to the page of the website that it's got it from, so it may misinterpret in its summary.
That's true, but with the greatest respect, let me just give you an example. Yeah. I was looking up if I could buy paracetamol in a supermarket in Germany. The large language model summary linked to a website, and the summary said, yes, you can. The truth is, no, you can't. And that is not what the link said either. So I'm just pushing you a bit on that, on
yeah,
how...
no, I think it's fair, and I think, like I said, it's still an area that we are ourselves trying to understand more and make sure that we are... Because I think, if it means that we need to be clearer in the way that we are producing that information, then that's something we can act upon. So if it is that model is, up front, just looking at the first 3 paragraphs of a press release to get the information, we need to make sure we're using the information in the right way. But it is an area that I think we need to also work with experts in this space that can help advise us in better ways to make sure that information is available. So at this stage, we've established it's happening, and we've got to make sure that the information we're providing is factual, correct, transparent. But I think there's more that we need to look into to make it as useful as possible and avoid the kinds of inaccuracies that you're saying. But there's a bigger system behind it which we might not have direct control over. So we're going to have to work within those kind of trade-offs, I guess.
I think you raised something interesting there about whether there is an ability to game to ensure that the large language models do pick up that information in the way that there used to be ways to game websites with using key search terms to ensure they appeared at the top of Google.
Yeah.
So, sorry, the YouTube and TikTok.
So YouTube and TikTok, so your question was...
Do you look at them and at what will come up if consumers search for the sort of things that you provide information and protection about?
Yeah, so we're not active on YouTube or TikTok at the moment. So if people search for things on there wouldn't be our content. It might be content that other groups or organisations where we are being discussed. So YouTube might result in the recent media interviews we might have done, or if one of our charities have been prominent about us. So we check it in that sense, in terms of whether we have been found because we're on other places, but because we don't put content on there, we don't expect to be seeing stuff that we are generating on there.
But do you look at it to see what will come up?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair. Just developing some of those themes around communication in particular. as someone who worked in comms for 15, 20 years, I understand some of the challenges you face, but some of the evidence we've got from the Grantham Institute for Policy and Communications said that Ofgem has been dismal in the current debate. At the moment, you cannot find on its website a breakdown of electricity bill costs. The most recent figure it has on its website is from August 2021, and yet is, as you've described, a major source of public dispute and debate. How do you respond to that specifically? But more generally, do you think that Ofgem has the credibility to act on behalf of consumers when it comes to electricity bills, and that consumers will see you as a trusted source and not part of what is, as you've rightly described, a very complex energy market?
Shall I start on that one? Priya may want to come in. So firstly, to recognise we are, in a world in which levels of trust have generally declined, we're a relatively well-trusted source, so 63% of the public have trust in Ofgem as a source of information, so that's really important, and we try to utilise that effectively. And on energy bills, we have actually begun to publish more information in this space. So we used to do a regular state of the market report. We've now restarted that. So last April, we published the first in the new series. It includes a detailed breakdown of energy bills and how that's changed over time. It includes comparisons of UK bills with other countries. It includes a lot of that sort of useful market information that will help consumers and commentators and other...
Do you do any work to help consumers specifically understand what the different components are that make up their energy bills? Because, you know, I'm not sure about everyone else, quite often you just look at the bit at the bottom and go, it's gone up or it's gone down. You don't necessarily know why, you don't necessarily know who to blame.
Yep.
Is there work that you can do? What work are you already doing in that space, and what more can be done?
Alongside the price cap, we do...
Yeah, so we recently overhauled our website, so last part of last year, because consumers were finding it hard to find that information. So we have, under the price cap section of the website, an explanation of what a bill will have, what information it will have on it, but it's broad. Because different suppliers will have different bills, so it really is incumbent on suppliers to make sure they're clear about what is on their bill and how they can understand the information on it, because they will have different approaches based on their consumers.
Do you have a role in that as well, though? Do you have a role in that, working with the companies, but also working with consumers? Say, this is what you should expect. This is the level of transparency that you should expect from your energy supplier as to what makes up the bills. Is that part of your role?
That's definitely part of that key licence condition that suppliers have to adhere to, which is very much about the bill and the clarity of information that should be on it for their consumers.
And do you feel that, you know, again, it's difficult being, I understand it's different being a regulator, however, do you feel you are proactive enough in that with the energy company to make sure that they are being very, very clear about what they're doing? When something changes, if government makes a policy change, that must be reflected on energy bills and their components. Is that something you do proactively, or is that something that you see much more as a facilitation role? Because again, I think there's a need, as been highlighted before, for consumers to see regulators as their champion as much as anything else, and not part of a very opaque system.
So I think that we are clear about what should be on a bill, and that's available. And we, like I said, the Energy Aware campaign at relevant points in time, we'll make sure that we put out content that refreshes things like, so around a price cap, which happens every quarter, we'll make sure we put content out that allows people to understand what their rights are and what they need to know. A consumer champion role, I would class someone like Citizens Advice as a consumer champion. You may know we are being reviewed at the moment, and one of the things that could be considered is there more as a regulator that we should be doing to be more directly in touch with consumers, to tell them more about their information and their rights outside of the other actors in the market, like suppliers themselves, who actually have licence conditions where they are obliged to make sure they're providing the right information. So, and I'll go back to something I said before, it's where is the consumer going to go first in order to get the information they need? And so when it comes to us, we're finding they're coming to us because they want to know who their supplier is, and that supplier is going to give them the information they need in relation to their bill, because there'll be things on there which is related to their usage that we wouldn't necessarily have information about. So if it's not clear on their bill that they can see how much electricity am I using versus how much gas I'm using, the supplier can do something about that, whereas we wouldn't be able to act on behalf of that consumer to do that. So I think it's about making sure the consumer's getting what they need from the person that's going to be able to provide it. There's probably space for us to consider whether we do more.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if that benefits the consumer.
Yeah, because what you're describing there is almost verging into ombudsman role, where you're saying we are going to act more collective. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it does again feel like there's a gap there where consumers are not able to fully understand a complex energy market, and where Ofgem, along with Ofcom, would have a role in making sure that's done.
Yeah,
Is that,
I think
it's picking up Mike's point. Is that fair? That there's a little gap?
I think that's fair.
And I think looking again at the changes coming down the line and the kind of long-term transition investments that are being made, how does Ofgem quantify those that investment in benefits, and is that something that can be made available to consumers in a more accessible form? Because again, we might talk about it around here, it's great we're investing in this and that's good for bills in the long term. Do consumers effectively understand that, and what's the role you have in that, and what's the role that suppliers have in that?
So on the big regulatory decisions that we're responsible for, so for example the network price controls, we are very clear in our communications about this is the decision we have taken, this is the investments that will follow from that, this is the cost of those, this is how and when that's likely to turn up on people's energy bills, and this is the benefits that consumers should get in the short, medium, long run from that spend.
You say you're very good at that, and it's fine. How do you make sure that the companies are communicating that? Because as you say, that's where they're going to go to for their information.
I think at that sort of granular level, I wouldn't necessarily expect a supplier to explain this is out of your bill, this particular line is investing in this particular asset, and I think that could even overcomplicate a bill for people. It's important, I think, that consumers, if they want to find that, they can find that. That's why, as I say, we're publishing more information in that space. There are other bodies that also publish information that consumers can go to.
But I guess just so the key place that people will find that kind of information is in the quarterly price cap announcement, where there is a breakdown of what that cap is made up of.
Consumers won't read that. They'll see the price cap moving and changing. Is there again, it's helping people understand how the price cap is got at. They will just see their energy bill going up or down.
That's why I think, so I guess if we're doing a quarterly price cap, it's incumbent upon us to be visible, to be out there on the media, to make sure that those people that consumers will be going to, for example, Martin Lewis, we have proactively made sure, even though we know we'll probably get a very hard time, going on there, answering direct consumer questions, because we know he's a key point where, especially on energy, where consumers are looking to him to provide that advice. So how can we make sure we're making sure he understands what we're doing? And that's where he will go into the cap, what makes up what part of the cap, ask us difficult questions about how we decide what costs go where. So I think we have to work with the media, broadcasters, our own channels to disseminate the information that is available, but as you say, consumers won't necessarily go to it. So how do we make sure we're reaching them through the largest channel and reach that we can?
I am going to end the session there because we've had quite a long time with you, and we are late, and we have two people waiting very patiently in the room for the next panel. But can I thank you all very much for your evidence today? There are some further questions that we will write you about, and you've all suggested the things you're going to send us. But thank you again. Session suspended. Order. Welcome back to the second panel on this afternoon's Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee hearing on our inquiry into building the case for the energy transition. If you can introduce yourselves, starting with Ben Goulding very briefly, please.
I'm Ben Goulding, I'm Director of the Clean Power 2030 Unit at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero.
And Chris Stark, I head up the Clean Electricity, Clean Power mission for the government.
Thank you very much for joining us and for being so patient, given just how late we now are. How well do you think the Clean Energy Superpower mission is being communicated?
Well, I think there are obviously things that one could do to improve the communication, always, but we are one of the most frontline policies of this government, with a minister who talks regularly about it as Secretary of State. And we continue to have lots of success in pursuing the mission, including particularly today. Today is an important day for us. We have some important results about how much new offshore wind we are able to bring onto the system over the course of the next few years, which keeps it high in the news. I think in the next phase of work, naturally, in the first 18 months, Ben and I and the team back in the department have focused extremely hard on the sort of industry discussion and the communication with industry, because we knew we needed to ensure that the infrastructure that needed to be built by 2030 would be there. The next phase, I think, needs to be much more about communicating to people the benefits of this transition. And there, I think we can accept that there is more to do.
Thank you. You said there's a minister who's communicating. You said it, you also said this is fundamental to the government's plans. A minister, but it's all of the government's plans. This touches multiple departments. It's at the heart of so much of what the government does. Is there a gap here where other departments, other ministers need to do more?
Well, look, I'm certainly not here to criticise other parts of government, but I will note that you are correct to say that, by and large, the mission, as we describe it usually, is largely seen as the department's mission. And the success of it is to see it in lots of different ways. I think the most notable part of the mission that I feel doesn't get enough emphasis is its impact on the economy more widely. So just to take today's announcement, for example, 8.4 gigawatts of offshore wind. Now, we often talk in gigawatts, but what does that mean in reality? Well, it means £22 billion of new investment into this economy. And with it, we estimate 7,000 jobs, and that's a conservative estimate. So that is something that I would like to see other parts of government discuss more freely, more openly, as a core part of the government strategy overall, in particular a core part of the growth strategy that we have in this country. I think the exciting thing is that the fact that we're able to have this discussion today, and the fact that I'm able to tell you this today, is because it has had the support of the Treasury and the Chancellor, because the budget for offshore wind was extended to allow that announcement to happen, for that auction to be a success. And therefore, I think this is something that we should be celebrating right across government.
Yeah, how would you think the public understand the plan?
Well, we haven't done specific evidence gathering on how people perceive the plan. There is lots of polling out there, and the department does some of its own gathering of information more on more general themes about the energy transition and on net zero. And regularly we see in that the populace is supportive of what we're trying to do to clean up the energy system, supportive of what needs to be done on climate, aware of the impacts of the climate change risks, and want to see action. It's an interesting question, one I don't have a direct answer to, about whether we should do that specifically for the Clean Power Plan. As I mentioned, the primary work we've done in the first 18 months has been focused more on industry to make sure that we got to where we need to, as I speak to you today.
Yeah. When Mission Control was established, there was an announcement that described the task as to turbocharge the government's mission and speed up the connection of new power infrastructure to the grid and cleaner, cheaper power to people's homes and businesses. What's your score of your achievements so far?
I feel. I mean, it must be a year since we came to see you last. So I feel in that year we have not wasted a single day. So it has been, tremendous to see the progress that's happened over the last 12 months, and that is the product of 18 months of hard work. I know I mentioned a few times today's announcement, but it really is important. If you want to build a clean power system in this country quickly, and I think we should for all sorts of reasons, notably energy security as well as climate. The very best technology to bring on is offshore wind, and the success we've had today is that keeps us on track for what we spelled out in terms of our ambition in the Clean Power Action Plan, which was published about 14 months ago now. So that seems to me is a tremendous success, and I feel very good about what we've done. Part of the job that I have and that Ben has is to constantly agitate about the things that are not happening as quickly as we would like them to. So I suppose in a sense I need to sort of remove that hat when I talk to you today, because when you stand back from it, and particularly when you speak to industry, they are regularly impressed by what's happening, feel feel the momentum that we've created by giving it such a sharp focus. So there's lots of things I wish we could have done quicker, lots of things that we've still got to do, but I feel pretty good about where we are on this mission.
Yeah, I mean, some of the reporting ahead of today's announcement suggested if the auction round hadn't gone as well as it did, that would have jeopardised the achievement of Clean Power 2030, but that still leaves the challenges around building the grid, which I just mentioned. There's also some reporting about the reordering of connection queues still being problematic. And then the installation of the clean sources of power, which obviously today is not insignificant. Are you on course to deliver clean power by 2030?
I think we are on course. Let me sort of count the ways in which I think it. So, it's not just about the announcement of 8.4 gigawatts of offshore winds. The thing that we have done over the last 18 months is, first of all, spell out very clearly the ambition that we had for 2030. And then, and this is, I think, the expression of the mission, then put policy around that in the best way that we could to make that happen. And when you look at the things that have been now implemented over the course of the 18 months, you mentioned some of them, we've consented at an astonishing pace new energy infrastructure. Much of that has come through the Secretary of State himself. We have, as you said, reformed a decrepit connection queue that we had in this country and were blighted by in this country, that was actually preventing development, not just in the energy sector, but right across the economy. Removed thousands of zombie projects from that queue to free us up to do generation and new storage, but also new prisons, new schools, new house building. So that has been implemented now at astonishing pace with the support of NESO. We have seen from Ofgem a green light now for what I think is genuinely a once-in-a-generation transmission build that facilitates the new generation and storage that we want to have on the system. That happened before the end of this year. And the best expression of the design changes that we've made to the policy environment is the announcement today. So we've made changes to the contract for difference to allow us to procure the generation that we think we need alongside all of the work I've just spoken about. That has also been a success. So look, are we perfectly on track? To be honest with you, we need to wait to see some further results from the next auction round. We've still got the onshore results to come in the next few weeks. But I feel very positive about where we are today.
Yeah, just in passing, you mentioned new house building. We await the new regulations on the new homes standard, which must be a frustration.
Well, listen, my prior role before joining government was in the Climate Change Committee, and we used to talk regularly about the importance of those regulations. So I can say that it's very important that we see them implemented as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, is an example where other parts of government perhaps are not acting as fast as you need them to.
Well, it's not one that directly influences the work that Ben and I do, but it will have an indirect benefit because we will see an impact from those regulations on the electricity system that we're building, and the more clean power we can provide to those homes, new homes, the better.
Now, I mentioned, this will be the third time I mentioned the grid and building the grid. You haven't directly answered using those words. Where are we on building the grid we need for 2030?
We're in a pretty good place. But I think it's important to say, though, that we recognise there are two very important projects when it comes to the building of the grid that at present are not on the right timetable. So just standing back from this, that shouldn't be a surprise to us or to this committee, because we have published our ambition to bring forward those projects more quickly. What's been achieved in the last year is that those projects are now in the planning system, so they are being assessed.
Could you just remind us what they are?
Yes, of course. So the big projects are Norwich to Tilbury and the Sea Link project, which goes with it. And these things are linked. They are presently on a 2031 timetable. And the importance of those projects is that they facilitate the clean power that we want to see built up and down the country, of course, particularly in the East Coast and particularly in Scotland. But the other importance of it is the consumer side of this, that if we're able to connect those projects more quickly, we relieve what we call a constraint in the system, which incurs costs that consumers are having to bear at the moment and shouldn't. So a big part of what we're doing in the Clean Power Unit and in the department is our bit to try and support as a rapid an assessment in the right and proper way of those projects, given the importance to the energy system. And we're in the middle of that now.
Just to add, because I think it's worth saying those in context, those projects are incredibly important. It's worth saying those are 2 of 88 projects that we need done across the grid for 2030. The other 86 are all currently on track and expected to be delivered by 2030. So those 2 are critical. They will make a material difference to constraints, but it's worth seeing in the context of the whole system.
They will make a material difference. Does that mean we're really talking about Clean Power 2031 then?
Not necessarily, because they're part of a much wider picture, but they will certainly help. And when I say material difference, it's that constraints point, that they will make a big difference to constraint costs in 2030. So the faster we can bring them forward, the more we drive down those costs, which is an important part of the story.
And just a bit more colour on this, since we're talking about it. If you'd asked me that question, you probably did ask me that question last year, but if you had asked me that question and I'd given a thoughtful answer to it, I probably would have said that one of the key issues that we were worrying about at that point was the supply chain for those projects. So did we have the cables ordered? Were there the people and the places that need to be to deliver them? If you speak to the 3 transmission owners, the TOs as we refer to them, they will all tell you now that the supply chain issues are in good shape. Now that has come because they are clear that we want to see these projects delivered and that the regulator would support those projects. So I do think we're moving on with them, but we are going to be very focused on ensuring that we have projects delivered on time and, if possible, ahead of schedule.
Yeah, and storage generally, long duration, short duration storage.
Yeah, well, we there's a slightly artificial divide between storage and long duration storage, which is on us. We made that distinction. The distinction we talked about was 8 hours. So in the plan that we published, we talked about batteries and the need for batteries at a much larger scale. You will see in the remaining queue of projects to connect to the grid probably an oversupply of batteries. So that tells me that we're in decent shape for batteries as long as those batteries feel they can enter the market and make a return. The other, and I have to say this is one of the most exciting bits of the story overall, is long duration as we defined it, 8 hours plus storage. And again, colleagues in Ofgem supporting us here with what they call a cap and a floor. Essentially it limits some of the risks of those projects by giving a cap and a floor to the returns that they can make. They have run a window, as they call it, to look for projects to receive that cap and floor, using the capacity numbers that we publish in our Clean Power Action Plan to guide it, and that has been oversubscribed. Now that project, that is a process that was designed to focus on pumped storage hydro, but has revealed a set of other technologies that can also provide similar system benefits. Now that's exciting to say that. These are really good things to have on the system as we build out a bigger and bigger renewables fleet, because they'll be able to store vast amounts of energy so we can consume them when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining.
Is it fair to say that the certainty of the plan, the speed at which things are going on, is making a difference in ensuring that you mentioned the supply chain before, that the supply chain is coming together and that the delivery is easier because of that degree of commitment?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of virtuous circle here. That, you know, the supply chain's belief that the government is committed leads them to be more committed themselves. And we saw that particularly today with the offshore wind announcement. For those of you who have been following this, you may know that before the new process for procuring offshore wind with the contract for difference is that we name a budget, as we call it, for the next allocation round. And then we have a process of running the auction, and if the bids for that auction go outside of the agreed budget, we get to see the bid stack, as we call it, and extend the budget if there is good value for money for the consumer. And we did that last year with this new approach to offshore wind. The industry were unsure that we would be able to extend that budget because, of course, it's something that must be agreed across government. The fact that we have extended the budget to pay for offshore wind, today I've been doing calls with developers all day, some of them unsuccessful in the auction, but the very fact that we did that has been reported back to me as a huge statement of commitment from this government to the sector. And it's a really interesting example of what I was referring to, where our expressed preference to support that sector and others in this clean power transition is being heard and is making the UK an interesting place to come if you're an investor, and making those investors that are already here more confident about making their investments.
Thank you. One question that springs to mind from today's exchanges in the chamber, Claire Coutinho mentioned the gas-fired power stations, and she says that the same number, the same capacity will be built whether it's under the current government's plan or under her alternative, and that affects the claims around how much cheaper wind is than gas. Does she have a point?
I find it difficult to understand that point. I mean, look, we're looking, when we talk about 2030, what we're talking about is the system we want to build for the 2030s and 40s. And the really important bit of context there, and this harks back to my old role in the Climate Change Committee, is that we are expecting to have a much bigger demand for electricity in this country that will have to be satisfied with new generation. And the question, therefore, is how is it satisfied? And what we want to do is to make that as cheap as possible, and also to have it as decarbonised as possible, and also build as much British industry around those technologies that we deploy as possible. And it seems to me on each of those metrics, offshore wind provides the best possible way forward. Wind also, given our resources onshore. And I think the comparison, therefore, of new gas to offshore wind is an entirely valid one. So we've been looking, we published actually today some new evidence on the cost of generation, which shows you that the gas plant would be perhaps £140 per megawatt hour compared to the 91 that we signed in the contract for AR7. So I think that's a legitimate comparison, and it's because we are anticipating a bigger power system in the future. And this is a challenge for this country, but it's also a challenge that every other country in the world faces. Growing power demand is something that we see regularly in all developed economies, and it's coming to the UK now. We're actually in the midst, I think, of the turning point for that. After decades of falling electricity demand, we've seen a flattening and probably a slight increase now in demand that's coming through, and that's what's driving that is new demand for things like electric vehicles, electric use of electricity for different sources, including heating and cooling in buildings, and electricity in industry. Now that's coming, and we should embrace it, because that story of electrification is a healthy story for the economy. We'll have to satisfy demand, and therefore doing so with something that is homegrown, with a good strong industry behind it, and that is noticeably cheaper than the alternative of gas is the right way to do it.
Thank you very much, Polly.
Thank you. This session is called Building Support for the Energy Transition. As you will know, the Sea-Link project has a direct impact on my constituents, and I'm wondering whether there have been any reflections by you on how we build support for the transition when my constituents will be adversely affected without any clear and direct benefit to the community in terms of either ownership, direct support for the energy transition themselves, and what they're basically told is, well, yeah, you get a load of kit. It's going to be really ugly. We're going to build it on a nature reserve, destroy a sea colony, threaten significant amounts of natural environment, which could indeed be helping to mitigate against climate change. But don't worry, you'll get a bit off your bills at some point in the future.
So it probably shouldn't comment on the individual project. I'll absolutely take the point, but in the general, it did come up.
And to be clear, it's supposed to be part of the Clean Power 2030 project, and by your own admission, Chris, it's not going to be ready until 2031 now. When I saw that it was on the schedule to be completed on December 2030, I thought that was a bit of an eye-watering level of ambition, bearing in mind the scale of it. And then on top of that, the fact is we are expecting, because of the nature of the regulation, that these places could be dug up again within 10 or 20 years. Can you see why we might be actually having a situation where the structure and strategy of our clean energy mission is militating against building support for the transition?
Yes, in some cases, and I wouldn't want to minimise the impact on communities, that there are some real difficulties that people feel this. I've been up and to Lincolnshire and some other parts of the East Coast to visit people and heard directly from who feel really, really strongly about these projects and the impact they have on them. And one of the really interesting things from that was it's not just the projects themselves, it's actually the process around it and the sort of what they describe as the life admin of having these things built in. So there is something about how do we make that easier. I think the point about nature is really important as well. So one of the things we are really keen to do is understand how we can make sure that these things have an actual overall nature positive impact. They can if they're built in the right way. There is inevitably a trade-off in some areas with sort of the need for this infrastructure, which will help drive down people's bills, which will help with the energy transition and local impacts. But I completely recognise those are real. They are felt very, very strongly.
I think the admin thing is the case for all building projects. And if you're at the beginning of your life or you think you might be able to move on, that might be one thing. If you're not, and this is going to be the way you're going to see out your days with trucks at the end of the road, that's another thing. These are the cases for all national infrastructure projects. The fact that this is going to damage nature when actually supposedly part of the purpose of tackling climate change is for us to protect nature seems to be an irony that seems to be lost on the department. And there is no obligation at the moment, and you pointed it out, for there to be some nature positive obligations around these projects, which actually mitigates against any support that you might get from the community, which loves their natural environment. Then on top of that, there is no obligation under the Clean Power Mission at the moment for these kinds of infrastructure, for the developers of these pieces of infrastructure, to support the community that is going to be host to this, to get any direct benefit from the energy infrastructure that they are putting in. Now, in Victorian times, it was poor people that put up with the consequences of fossil fuel dirty pollution. Now, I don't want it to be the situation where communities, simply because we are rich in the resources of renewable energy, for whatever reason, that end up being told to suck it up. Can you give me an example of how the department might mitigate some of these challenges or put some obligations on the developers who otherwise are just going to go and say, yes, I'm really sorry you've got trucks coming along, but you'll get £5 off your bills in 20 years' time?
Yeah. Well, firstly, there is that, I don't want to overstate the £5 off the bills in 20 years' time. We have consulted on...
The specifics are not the point. The generalities of both the inconvenience, which we've acknowledged, but particularly the issue about nature protection and specific energy benefit for a community that is going to be disrupted for decades, possibly again, because of the way that our regulatory system works. And somebody just basically shrugs. I don't think that's good enough, and I don't yet have an answer from the department that satisfactorily meets the concerns of my community, particularly when they are there is no acknowledgement of the fact that they should be able to benefit from the energy transition because of the kind of disruption that they're going through.
Absolutely hear that, and very happy to write in the detail of some of that. What I would say on nature, I think there are opportunities for us to go further, and I think I'd absolutely acknowledge that. We're advised by something called the Clean Power Commission, and we have on that someone called Craig Bennett, who is an expert in this, who advises us, who acts as a nature champion for the project. I think he is very clear that we could do more in many of these projects to still build them, but build them in a way which is much more in tune with nature, which is, so for instance, he talks about things like using very long vertical infrastructure as wildlife corridors, which we can do. There is a lot more we can probably do in that space. We're very happy to keep pressing on that.
And community benefit?
And
large infrastructure projects?
And community benefit, the department has consulted on, we have a policy on, I'm happy to run on the detail.
Which doesn't actually cover large infrastructure projects like this. It's only mostly about energy generation rather than about transmission, and that's my point. So it would be good to see that the department does acknowledge that transmission infrastructure does also require some kind of community benefit for the people who host it.
Noted.
Thanks.
Well, we wait to hear back from you in more detail. You mentioned you've been to Lincolnshire. As it happens, the next questions are from Melanie On, who's an MP in Lincolnshire.
Link.
I can imagine what you were in Lincolnshire discussing. Chris Stark, would you describe yourself as a zealot?
I mean, my wife might. My wife calls me many things, but I'm not sure she's ever called me that. I have been described as a zealot. I regard myself as entirely non-zealot about the issues that I work on, but others have different views.
I wonder in terms of generating confidence in the community, whether zealotry or a sense of having blinkers on or not being as sensitive to, I think, what is a change in public attitude is a problem in terms of where the message carriers come from from a government.
Let me take this straight on because I feel it, right? I mean, like, I've spent my career working on this topic, and therefore I've accumulated quite a lot of knowledge about it, but it also makes you the carrier of a message that comes with, you know, that reputation of already having thought it through. So it's a slightly odd thing, but I mean, we need many different approaches to make a success of a transition like this, and it cannot just be framed as something that's good for the climate, or indeed, you know, good for any of the other things that are associated with what we're trying to do here. One of my frustrations is that we haven't yet, I think, thought through how we present that message in a different way. We have been focused. We've been running hard at this for 18 months, and it is definitely an ambition that the government has set that was framed around the climate objectives. But it turns out it meets many of the other objectives that this government has set. I would like to see more voices out there talking about what we're doing here, because I think there's huge benefits from all sorts of other agendas.
And you mentioned in your previous response about homegrown energy. You were talking about it in the context of security, but essentially homegrown, 7,000 jobs, £22 billion worth of investment. But much of it isn't homegrown. I mean, our resources are homegrown. Some of the personnel is homegrown, but much of it isn't. Much of it is brought in from the Middle East, China. The companies, I regularly hear, the companies, they're not UK companies that are running these projects. I've got a lot of time for Ørsted and RWE and Vattenfall. They're not UK companies. So how do we say to the public that with the disruption that your community might be facing, with the very lengthy process, I mean, we're talking about AR7, but that is, you know, going to be delivered over 20 years' time. How do we say that this is good for you and for the country?
Well, look, you're right. Everything you've said is correct. I mean, the important thing to say is there is a lot of British content already in the things that have been done. And those inward investors that have chosen to come here, and you've mentioned a few of them, have substantial operations here. I'll choose another. Siemens is a really good example, right across all of the energy supply chain. If you go to a place like Newcastle, you will find people employed in a whole host of sectors in this energy transition that would not be here were it not for the policies that have been made by this government and the ones before it. So the purpose of what we're trying to do is not to continue with the approach that was there before, but to try and build in extra incentives for that UK content, as we sometimes call it, to be established here. Tomorrow we will have the outcome of what we call the Clean Industry Bonus, which is largely for those companies that have been successful in the auction, and that is designed to essentially accelerate and to top up and to give a greater incentive to those companies to do more of their work in the UK. Now, without spoiling the surprise tomorrow, we're so excited about what we've seen through that policy, because we were able to then see directly the multiples that we get by a little bit of support on top of the contract for difference to bring what would otherwise be imported technology or imported labour straight to the UK. And I think the other part of it is what we were discussing earlier, that the amount of confidence that we're trying to transmit to that industry is also an attraction to do that work here rather than somewhere else. I've spent a long time in Hull recently. I've been back up and down to Hull. I'll come to Grimsby. Let me give you that commitment.
Tell me about Hull.
Very, very happy to come to Grimsby. And it's, there's a huge swathe of the population in Hull that's now involved in the renewables sector, and they work in it. So I think it's a really good story, actually, if we frame it in the right way. And I would love to see more of it. It's perfectly possible for us to do that. The next wave of that is about the subcontractors that don't even think of themselves sometimes of working in that renewables sector. They might be working in the oil and gas sector right now. It's the ports and the infrastructure.
We have been saying that for a really long time, though.
And
I don't want to kind of rain on your parade, and I'm very supportive. I've got Siemens across the river in lovely Hull, and 2 big operations and maintenance bases in my constituency. Long kind of recognise that there is opportunity, but this is the same thing that has been said since the industrial strategy of 2017, and I wonder whether it wears a little bit thin, and I wonder if we talk a kind of decarbonising the power supply is not the most interesting of titles for the general public. I'm sorry. I wonder.
I tend to agree.
I wonder, if there is anything that says, that this is enough, that this is the crux of the story that's going to sell it, that says, we are on a trajectory to great things in the future.
Well, I'll tell you what, right, have me back once we get these results from the Clean Industry Bonus, because
I'll get you back when we get the 7,000
and we'll come the other side, I'll come across the river. But this is the point, right? We don't want to see a continuation of that. I agree, it does wear thin unless you start to see the results of it. I think we will this time.
Okay. And in terms of public attitudes, do you think that so DESNZ had a public attitudes tracker, and the headline findings from summer last year say, in the short term, 69% expect the transition to net zero to increase their living expenses, up from 65%. 7%, only 7% saying that they expect a decrease. In the long term, 50% expected an increase in living expenses and 25% expected a decrease. It doesn't feel like the mission is connecting with the real lives and expectations of people in the country at the moment.
No, and I think it's our job to make sure that it does, because I mentioned earlier that inevitably when you try and do something as ambitious as this, you've got to start with the things that take longest. So that has involved us focusing most on the infrastructure that we thought needed to be built. And if you don't move quickly on that, then you can't tell a story about what you're trying to do by 2030. I really feel we can tell a better story about how this will impact positively in people's lives after this. It's partly about those jobs that I talked about up and down the country. It is also about, I do think people care about getting stuff built and seeing governments able to do that, and seeing that investment that I talked about. But the really exciting stuff is once you have that cleaner power system that we're referring to, there's lots of opportunities for consumers to save more money through that. Then that doesn't need to feel like a climate programme that you're experiencing. It's at the moment I have a bee in my own bonnet about the richest in society are the ones who benefit most from those technologies presently. So if you can afford it, you can have the Tesla in the driveway, charged at home very cheaply, solar panels on the roof, the heat pump at home, a battery. That allows you to save a lot of money, and I would like to see those benefits pushed down to those people who can least afford them at the moment, and that's a big part of what we expect to do in the next phase of this work, and that turns it into a different sort of story, one that isn't so disengaged from people.
Do you think the opportunity to become a net exporter of energy will help in the narrative with the general public?
I do. I mean, I was meeting someone earlier and relating a story, actually, of my own experience of being in Aberdeen and being in an electric car. With the driver of that car was not very enamoured with the Secretary of State, I'll be honest with you. But he was extremely pleased to have a car that he could charge for nothing and sometimes be paid to charge. and we didn't talk about climate change at all. It struck me that was someone who was excited about this new opportunity that he had to, what we would say technocratically, engage with the energy market. But what does that really mean? It means that the driver of that car had an opportunity to charge his car up cheaply, and he enjoyed driving it. Now, there are more of those stories to come, and in a sense what we're trying to do is build the infrastructure to make that happen.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Graham Down.
Thank you, Chair. Just to actually pick up on some of the what Melanie was saying just now, there's certain words and terms that government use that means absolutely nothing to anybody else, or through repetition. So innovation, sustainability, at some point they lose all meaning. They are defined as a good thing, but no one knows what they mean. Is the term net zero in danger of falling into the same trap, and actually, by extension, just transition? We use these phrases interchangeably. We use these phrases constantly. We think they're a good thing. If you say that to the person in Aberdeen, they will either go, I don't know what you're talking about, or go, oh God, not that rubbish. Is that fair? And how much of the language that we use actually affects how people see what this government and others previously have attempted to do?
That you asked me about net zero is the thing that I'm most closely associated with personally, as the leader of the team that first advised that it should be set as a target. And let me give you an answer to that question directly. Has it lost its currency? Yes, it has. And the reason for that is that it's taken on... I think it's very interesting when you hear it talked about now, it often has the word agenda at the end of it. So net zero agenda. It is not an agenda, but that is what people associate it with now. It is a scientific target, and it's a very sensible one for this country to have. That needn't be the way in which we brigade all the things that we're doing to achieve it. So I fear it has lost its impact and its positive association. That doesn't mean that we need to abandon the pursuit of it, but I think we should be thinking very carefully about the language that we use. One of the very best things I've ever participated in was something that this Parliament in a different time committed to do, which was a piece of a climate assembly, as we called it at the time, a really important participative process which 6 select committees in the Commons supported, to understand what people in this country thought about how net zero should be achieved. And I think the results of that still stand, that it was an amazingly important thing to have done that, and it had lots of rich insight within it. And you would find some of the answers to those questions from the people who participated in that, the 106 people that were selected from across the country. They are turned off by the language. They are excited, actually, by some of the things that need to be done in pursuit of the climate objectives this country has set, but often they're not hearing that from their politicians or leaders in the private sector.
Do we need to stop talking about one overarching thing, net zero, and should we now just say we are making our energy bills cheaper, we're doing this, and do the public care how we're doing it? And we need to get beyond the climate idea. That's why that is one of the purposes, obviously, but do the public just need to know we're doing a good thing? It's what we need to do, and rather than badging under net zero. Again, you go around private companies who will say our net zero agenda, and every time I hear a large company say that, my eyes tend to roll somewhere into the back of my head, because I know I'm about to get a bunch of what used to be corporate social responsibility, which has kind of evolved through. Do we need one term or do we need multiple terms? And I guess the end point of that is, does the Secretary of State need a new job title?
Well, that's certainly above my pay grade. At some point, I suppose he will have one. But the importance of this is really clear to me. I do think we should talk about the things that we are doing rather than the pursuit of the overall goal. I think it's important to maintain our focus on that overall goal. But in a sense, we're not going to win this argument if there's only one reason for doing all this, which is the achievement of a statutory target. I mean, it seems to me that's the least appealing reason to do this. Again, I'll give you my own personal perception of this, which is that we've been, I think, through quite a slightly weird period where net zero did take on, I think, had a larger connotation than was ever intended in previous governments. It was enough to put net zero as a tag on various programmes of work and see them supported by government. We're well past that programme.
The risk now that by calling it, as you say, an agenda, we've made it a target. It's one that you can shoot it down. It's something you can use to undermine, as politically we've seen recently, that consensus around the need to tackle climate change and a warming planet has become, because it encompasses so many things, anything that's bad that can happen now, we can say, oh, it's part of the net zero agenda.
Yes, I do think that's a risk, but I don't think it's a risk that we've fallen into directly. I think it's something that this government has done. I think it is the way in which that topic of net zero is discussed.
How do we?
Well, I think that we approach it in the way that you suggested in your earlier question, is that we get down to looking at the things that we are doing that have a broad set of objectives, including net zero. So, in the work that Ben and I do on clean power is as much about the energy security of this country as it is about climate objectives of this country. It is definitely about the consumer impacts for this country, and it is also about the employment and industrial impacts that we can have in this country. Now, it so happens that we are also helping the climate by pursuing those things, and it seems to me that most people, in my experience at least of 15 years working on this, most people do care about climate change, but they put it as a secondary concern to something prior to that. And the things that we are doing right now across the economy, and it's not just in the Clean Power programme, have a whole host of benefits that we could and should talk more about.
Can I just follow up,
Yep.
please, Chair? Would you get rid of net zero from the department's title?
If only to make it a department that one could pronounce in an acronym more accurately, perhaps that would be the best reason to do it. Desens. Look, I think it is a department that is focused on net zero, and I think that does tell you something about the priority that the government gives to it. And I think there is a very important part of my department focused on the achievement of net zero, and the approach that we have to take across government at running that essentially as a programme is done from the Department for Net Zero. I think that does mean something. But frankly, you could call the department anything you like. I think it's important that the work is done rather than that it's given a proper name in the department.
About building support for the transition. Therefore, actually language matters. That's why I'm asking you the question.
Well, look, if it helps you, my email address is energysecurity.gov.uk, and most people understand what that means. And I think I often fall back on that when people ask me, as they did today with the security guard asked me where I worked. I said the Department of Energy Security.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vera.
Hello.
Hi.
I probably also call myself still a zealot. I know you're not, but I
am. Proud zealot.
Net zero policies are increasingly seen as unaffordable, ineffective and politically toxic. Not my words, but the Tony Blair Institute. Does the breakdown of what we are now calling the political consensus, and we can even question whether there ever was a political consensus, but let's say there was a political consensus that has now broken down, have the real power to derail the whole plan, or at least delay it quite substantially?
I mean, it worries me that there has been a breakdown in the political consensus. As someone who's worked on this topic, we are a government that, of course, has a majority and are able to do lots of things without that political consensus. But in mainstream politics, it does matter. And as a civil servant, of course, I serve the government, but I observe that is more and more of a challenge. Will that derail the programme? Well, not for us working on clean power. I mean, we have a whole host of reasons to want to see us deliver the things that we've laid out as our ambitions. But it will only work if the transition continues, of course, into the 2030s and 40s. So, of course, I worry about the consensus on this. Again, I'll go back to some of the evidence on this, though. I think you will find that all the evidence shows you that people in this country do care about climate change and do care actually about the achievement of net zero. On balance, they support it. So we need to bring them more and more evidence of the success that we're having for a whole host of reasons, as reasons to further support that.
Does it affect the willingness of businesses to engage or make the investments? Because in the end, it is all about, certain things are about sentiment, aren't they? So business need to feel that they're investing in the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, I've definitely seen sentiment drop off, and that is something else that concerns me, because of course most of the transition will be driven by private investment, and we do need our corporate community to support that. Again, it probably goes back to some of the earlier questions. It was great to have such explicit support for net zero in the last 5 to 10 years, let's say. the fact that many of those corporates make less of their net zero commitments now than they used to, whilst it worries me, I'm less worried as long as they are still making the investments that we require, and that is by and large what we've seen on the energy side at least. And were you going to say something?
No, it's just I think it is worth coming back to that, what the evidence tells us about what the public actually think, what business sentiment actually is, and it's still quite positive. So there's huge support for action on climate change, there's huge support for building renewables, there's huge support when you ask people, do you want renewables built near me? I think the business sentiment, business talks less about net zero, and I think that's to a certain extent following what they see as the thing that is sort of talked about publicly. But Chris is right. All of the evidence is that the investments are still being made at huge scale. We've seen over £60 billion of investments announced the last year or so. So the action is heading the right direction. I do worry about the supporting rhetoric.
And there's obviously also a global dimension to this. The US is obviously signalling a walk away from net zero. Does that also affect business? It's not, because we can't really look at what we do here in the UK in total isolation.
No.
Does that also have an effect on business willingness to invest? The sort of global picture?
The global picture does. Obviously, the US will make its own decisions. I think, again, if you look at the entirety of the global picture, investments into renewable energy, into the speed of the rollout of electric vehicles and other action on climate change is at record levels globally. So the sentiment, the global consensus absolutely matters, and I think there are lots of risks around that. Again, looking at sort of a level below the noise, the action and the level of investment is going very well.
And would you say we are already so far down the road as business and communities that now swinging back would almost,
I'd frame it slightly differently, which is that we're so far down the road that actually the economics has taken over. So a lot of the reasons these investors are going is not because people are for or against net zero, for or against action on climate change. For a lot of businesses around the world, it's simply that the cost of a lot of the technologies has come down so much that it's simply economic sense to keep investing.
Thanks very much. Lizzie.
Thanks, Chair. So our session is all about building support for the energy transition, and I want to talk about the cost of electricity as part of that. Now, from the previous evidence that you've both given to the committee, I'm going to take it as read that you think making electricity cheaper is important. To that. Evidence from others have talked about that in terms of support for the transition, but also the affordability of technology, such as heat pumps and things like that. My question is, do you think that's the most effective way to make sure we complete the energy transition? What works best in terms of building support for the energy transition? Is it simply cost incentives? Or is it the storytelling about climate change? And realistically, how quickly are my constituents going to see the benefits of the clean power mission?
It's a complicated question. There's a whole mix of things, actually, I think is the answer. So, and it's different for different people. For some people, absolutely, it's about the cost. So all of the evidence is that moving to clean power will drive down wholesale costs of energy. That's the foundation for lower costs in the longer term. People need to feel it now, and that's why you have action like the extra £150 off the average bill that was announced in the budget. That's why you have the action to expand the warm home discount to 6 million homes or so. It's more than cost for some households, I think. So one of the things that's really interesting, when people do install things like heat pumps, levels of customer satisfaction reports are incredibly high. So there's something which is just about hearing from your neighbours, hearing from other people who've taken action. One of my previous roles, if we're doing previous roles, was running the Department's energy efficiency programmes. And one thing that was interesting in that is the decision to get people to take up energy efficiency measures in the home was often not anything to do with our website, as they saw scaffolding going up on a next door house. And they heard people say, yeah, it's warmer, it's more comfortable. So there is just something about hearing from your neighbours about the lived experience of it and about the satisfaction of this stuff works and it actually makes you feel more comfortable.
And are there any lessons for the government from that knowledge in how we talk about this?
I think there are. And I think we've been learning them quite a lot. So actually, in the context of Clean Power, one of the things that it will be really important more and more is that where people will feel the benefit of this isn't going to be about national programmes, it isn't going to be about the statistics that say we've gone up another percentage point towards 95% clean power. It's going to be about people feeling this in their local area. So it's when jobs are advertised down the road, it's when you see actions, or when your next door neighbour gets a job, when somebody installs a heat pump. So more and more, I think we are thinking quite a lot about how we engage in those local areas, in more local communication strategies and more distributed strategies. And there's quite a lot we can learn as we go along.
Chris, have you got any comments on cost of electricity and the role in the energy
transition?
transition?
In the next phase of this, it's no surprise that we are completely laser focused on trying to extract as much value as we can for the consumer on this, and today's announcement actually is part of that. So it's a really good outcome for the consumer, and I think you'll see more of that when we have the next set of announcements on renewables in the coming weeks. At the start of February, we should get the onshore results. So every reason to think that will be an even better story. So we've got to keep making sure that we, tell a good story that is widely understood, that is not just about, the climate benefits we're trying to do, and is actually much more about people feeling that we are on their side and what we're trying to do here. On top of that, it is an immense relief again to me personally that the budget happened a few weeks ago and that we were able to talk about taking £150 off bills. But if it ends there, then that's not enough. So we've got a story that needs to play out over the course of this year and the ones after it about focusing on those who most need the support. And we've done that particularly notably with things like Warm Homes Discount. And I think as we go into the next phase of this new energy system that we've been discussing here and in a select committee gives opportunities for people to save money in different ways. And I would like to see those opportunities go to those people who most need them rather than those who are most able to afford the technologies that permit them. And in the forthcoming Warm Homes Plan, I think you'll see some of that too. So these things are hard, and we are trying to do as much of this as we can as quickly as possible, but I don't think we'll be successful if all we do is focus on gigawatts. We've got to get down to making lives better for people in this country as a result of all this.
Mindful time.
Isn't it rather important? I mean, of course, it's important that the poorest in society have support as a priority, but isn't it really important, equally important, arguably more important, if we want to be able to deliver for the poorest, that there is strong public support through the fact that there is a universal offer which delivers cheaper bills? And do you see that we will see, I mean, obviously £150 in the budget is a universal offer, but will we see more than that this year as far as you're concerned?
Well, we have the Warm Homes Plan coming, so there is more to say.
Might go beyond the poorest in society.
It's difficult for me to say too much about that because it's still in preparation, but the Warm Homes Plan is focused on some of the issues.
It's all right, we won't tell anybody. You can.
They tend to watch. That's I have to say to my cost.
Can I just follow up on that? Almost everybody that we've taken evidence from in terms of our cost of energy inquiry has said the primary thing, if we want to be able to make sure that the transition happens as fast and as fairly as possible, is to make electricity cheaper. What recommendations would you have for energy market reform that would enable that to happen?
Well, again, so we've taken a first step. Electricity cheaper relative to gas, is that? Or just in general, electricity cheaper?
Cheaper.
Just cheaper.
I mean, obviously, also relative to gas. So forgive me for asking 2 questions in one.
Yes. Well, let's separate the two. On relative to gas, I think we've taken the first step, and actually cheaper in general with the action taken in the budget, because some of that is moving some of the levy costs, particularly renewables obligation, to the Exchequer. So that instantly not only reduces the total bill, it reduces electricity relative to gas, because that's all on the electricity bill. More broadly, making electricity cheaper, I think it is going to be a mix of things. I think clean power is part of that, because it absolutely does drive down the wholesale cost. There is a challenge in that there's a cost of paying for the infrastructure as we go along. I think it's a long-standing issue of how you get electricity cheaper in absolute terms, and if I had the answer to that, I would be delighted. But I think the shift to clean power, action directly on the bill as we've taken, and Increasingly, the more we can get people access to things like electric vehicles, batteries, which can be cheap and can be rolled out to poorer households and are being through some of the schemes, and people can engage with the energy system and with flexibility, that's the way that people can feel the benefits and the bills quite sharply.
Thank you. Hi, Rhea.
Thank you, Chair. Interesting you mentioned batteries there, because I understand from the press it's been removed from the Future Homes standard, so we see if that remains or not. When you, to both of you really, but perhaps what's done, when you appeared last time, you described Mission Control's controls environment as rudimentary, and you described dashboards still being assembled and that you didn't have assurance arrangements in place. You also accepted that independent assurance would be needed. So can you tell the committee, have you now moved from that start-up phase into mature delivery? And what independent assurance now exists to give Parliament confidence that you're managing risks actively rather than just observing?
I'll pick this up and Ben do chip in. But I'm glad to see things have moved on since we gave that evidence. And part of it actually was the questions that you asked us that moved that on more quickly. Very happy to see that we have fully functioning dashboard now. That's proved very, very useful to have it. And this idea of being data driven in this mission is absolutely at the core of what we're trying to do. And to be honest with you, my main reflection on that is that this is something that other parts of government could do as well. So this is something to be learned, I think, about the fact that we've given it such a sharp focus. There's a lot of data and energy that you can use, so I suppose we benefit from that. But we've also had the support of Ofgem and particularly NISO, who have a lot of really great data that they've been willing to share with us. Best expression of that has been the reforms that we've made to that connection queue that I spoke about earlier. And what that gives us essentially, as it reaches its conclusion now, is the set of projects that are happening across the country, and that allows us to move into the next phase of actually kicking the tires on those projects, trying to pick out the ones that we want to try and accelerate because they've got the right potential to do so. So that's the work of the first part of this year. In terms of assurance, what we've said internally is that we can't really make a full assessment of progress yet until we've had the full results of AR7. So once we've got that, that's the first opportunity that we've had really to sort of stand back and look at it. And I think we'll want to do something that draws together what we've learned from that in the first half of this year as well, which will then be an invitation for further scrutiny of what we're doing here. But I'm confident we'll have the data to support all of that, and we've got the arrangements in place to do it now.
At the previous session as well, you were very candid that there were obstacles that you haven't stumbled across yet. I think that was the words you used. And I think from today's session and from the evidence, political consensus and probably public support in some cases for the transition to net zero, to the energy transition and for net zero could be one or two of those. What is Mission Control now doing differently to mitigate those risks, and particularly those risks to having public support for what you're doing and what the government wants to achieve?
We've identified public support as something that we want to consider. So the other bit of the other step that we've taken is to put together an independent set of advisors who sit above all of this in what we call the Clean Power Commission. We've just reappointed them. They were temporary appointments in the first phase. We've now got a full set of appointments for the remainder of this Parliament. Stellar appointments, really fantastic people. And one of the things that group has identified is that they want to consider the public attitudes towards what we're doing here. I think it's important for me to say to you here, I feel that we have only limited influence over that, because I think there's a broader topic that you are considering as part of this inquiry that needs to be considered along the way. I think the things I'm particularly interested in are things that you were referring to earlier about individual projects. Now, we're always a bit cagey about individual projects when they are still being considered during in the planning process. Once they're out of the planning process, I think we can learn lots of lessons about how to do these things well with the energy companies who are developing these projects.
The concern is that it'll be too late for that.
Well,
I
share
in
that
particular
concern,
project.
but it is difficult for Ben or I or any of the officials involved in this to talk about specific projects while they're still being assessed by ministers. So that is a challenge. That's one of those obstacles that we refer to. But there is a general need, I think, for us to step back and assess where we are 18 months in, and we're going to do that with the Commission over the next few weeks.
And my final question, Chair. Affordability has repeatedly been identified as a decisive factor in public support and Chris, you acknowledged that Clean Power 2030 may leave bill payers no poorer rather than materially lower. Are you confident that's enough to sustain public backing?
I think we can move that up a notch. So I feel confident that we can bring bills down, and I am also confident that there are further opportunities for us to do even more of that. So I think you will see us focus this year on those opportunities. It takes us into, and this draws together some of the other evidence that you've gathered today, I think, it takes us into perhaps a different conception of what we mean by bill savings. So we did an enormous amount of work last year leading to the announcement that was in the budget, and very proud of that work. And that's what results in £150 off your average bill. There are diminishing returns to continuing to do the sort of very policy-driven work that does that. When you look at the energy system, there are costs that must be recovered. They're mostly legacy costs, but there are costs that must be recovered somewhere. They're either on the bill or they're on the taxpayer. That is fundamental. There is perhaps a little bit more of that, so we can wring it out a bit further. But we move into a different phase where I've talked about the warm homes discount, which is targeted support. I think there is more of that to come. And then we move into what is the most difficult thing to describe, but probably the most exciting bit of all of this, which is what we commonly refer to as the flexibility of the power system, and ensuring that a flexible power system, which gives you the opportunity to save money at different points of the year or the week or the day, that we give those opportunities to those people who could most do with that saving. And that idea of a more flexible power system bringing those benefits is where I think we will find even bigger savings. And my taxi driver friend is the one who's demonstrating just that. That these are real tangible savings that come largely through technologies that facilitate that. And I think probably an element of policy and regulatory reform to facilitate that. Now, that is exciting to me because of the course of this year and beyond. That's what we can get focused on now.
I'll ask one very quick question, Chair. Last time, Chris, you said you would not do this job if you did not believe 2030 was achievable. Ben, is Clean Power 2030 still achievable?
Clean Power 2030 is still achievable.
And Chris?
Absolutely, still achievable.
I'd like to ask some questions about communities in relation to the Clean Power Action Plan, just to follow up a little bit on what I asked earlier. In the action plan it says communities will see clearer links between local projects and local benefits. We took a lot of evidence about community energy from NESO, from National Grid DNO, from SSEN and others. And the conclusion after I realised quite a lot of evidence was ultimately I got the answer from Matt McGill from NESO that the current system does not have the signals in place for community energy. Would you agree?
I'll step in. Ben's drawing breath. No, I think there is lots that can be done. I think we could do more, and we will shortly publish the local power plan, which will give some colour to some of this. But I started my career working in community energy projects in Scotland, and I feel very passionate that there's more that can be done here.
Okay, well, there's an 8 gigawatt.
There is.
Right, is it an ambition, an aspiration, a goal, objective, a target, or a commitment?
All of the above.
Right. If that's the case, why is there no obligation on NESO, on DNOs, on GB Energy, or on Ofgem to make that 8 gigawatt target happen?
I think this is on us. We have not done enough to characterise what that 8 gigawatts means, and we still stumble over basic concepts like local projects and community projects, whether that means the same thing.
We had quite a lot of faffing around from people claiming that they needed to define things, and I was like, stop it, this has been going on since the 1970s.
The 8 gigawatts, listen, all of those numbers came through me personally, and the 8 gigawatts is a big number because I wanted to see ambition about this, and we've been a little slow on this, I'll say, so I think we're into the phase now where we should move more quickly on.
So will there be obligations on those institutions, both private and public, in order to be able to achieve that 8 gigawatt target, and on what time frame?
There may be obligations. I'm afraid I don't know what time frame, and I don't know what those obligations would be right now.
Okay, so we will need to come back to you on that over time. Yeah. And you're saying that the local power plan may include this?
It will include some quite exciting stuff, so it's coming together nicely, and it's mainly about what Great British Energy themselves are going to be able to contribute to this.
Yeah, because Great British Energy talk about their community energy in a box, so they've got an idea about how they might help, but they don't have any obligation to do this.
No, they don't have an obligation to do it, and I question whether they need one actually, because they've got the capacity to do it and the funding to do it.
One person said to us that if they were told by Ofgem to do this, then they would. If the Minister tells NESO to tell Ofgem to tell you to connect to a community energy company instead of to EDF, for example, that is what you would do. And the DNO operator said, yes, absolutely. So that feels like a chain of command issue, isn't it? At some point, people are saying, oh, no, not me, Gov.
Hard to argue with the question you just asked me, because I think the premise of it is correct. But I'm also aware that we put a lot of obligations on a lot of people, and it makes the energy system a very complex thing. So I would rather that we were doing things because it was the obvious thing to do.
But if it is, as you say, an ambition, an aspiration, a goal, an objective, a target and a commitment, somebody's got to do something and somebody's got to be told to do it.
Correct. So
we look forward to finding out who. Thank you.
Right. Couple of final questions. I'm sure there'll be final questions. We were in South Wales last year, and we heard from former steelworkers who, in spite of Minister's very strong words about the transition being about decarbonisation, not deindustrialisation, they don't believe it. That's not been their experience. What's the answer to this? How, in building trust, what's your role in ensuring that those communities that have experienced deindustrialisation in the past, which is quite a significant part of the country, are convinced that the energy transition is in their interests?
Well, I live in a part of the country that has seen the impacts of deindustrialisation in the past, in the west of Scotland, and it's again something that we absolutely must avoid in the coming transition. But let's just deal with the facts about the fossil fuel transition, which is sadly one of the things that we see when you look at the transition ahead, and my old colleagues in the CCC have done the work on this. You will see that there is more employment, good employment in the low carbon sector in the future, but fossil fuel industries tend to be highly geographically specifically located. So you get this kind of contrast. Now often politicians and people who talk about it, whether they're zealots or not, often refer to the fact that employment will go up and that this is something we should always look forward to. But the problem is that won't be true for every part of the country unless we make it so. So I think it's really important that when we think about something like the Clean Power programme, given the vast sums of investment that are flowing through some of the things that we're trying to pull off here, that we are targeting support as much as we can to those communities that will see otherwise a negative impact on employment. And I think we will be able to do some of that through the work that Ben and I are trying to do on clean power, notably through things like the Clean Industry Bonus. If you are pushing investment to the parts of the country that you know would otherwise suffer, then I think you can have a good story to tell. And the place I have most foremost in my mind is the north east of Scotland when I talk about that. Yeah. So we've got to make that right. Yeah, well, you've already offered to come back and talk about the clean energy bonus. I think we might be seeing you more than once a year. That's right. The other, I asked you a bit about this before, the cross-government coordination of this agenda. What's your role in coordinating policy and communication?
So the sort of cross-government, there's an architecture behind this. This is one of the missions for government. There are various cross-government groups that talk about this. But if I give one or two examples, because it's useful. So, for instance, there is a new board that DEFRA set up, which is overseeing all sorts of infrastructure, and it coordinates all of the work that DEFRA's various arms-led bodies do on the environmental aspects of that infrastructure. I sit on that. It has regular discussions of energy, transport, all of the things that cut across all of the different missions, all the different action we need in infrastructure. That's one example. There are lots of structures like that have been put in place to make sure this is much more of a whole government effort.
Okay, give us a bit more.
A bit more flavour.
When you say lots of, what does that mean?
There are the mission boards that have been in place from the outset. There are various other things like sort of the infrastructure committee across government, the NISTA, which is one of the new body that brings together what was the IPA and other structures, does lots of coordination, has a kind of pipeline across all infrastructure. So it will get quite dull if I go down to lots of kind of interdepartmental committees, but I just want to reassure that they are there and building quite a lot of momentum now.
Yeah, all right, just as an example, there's been a number of high-profile announcements from the Department of Transport recently, and having listened to and read the statements made by ministers, there is no reference to the energy transition or the element of decarbonisation of transport that it is supposed to include. What's going on there? 'Cause it feels like there should be, whether it's talking about roads and
buses.
But yeah, indeed, or even potholes actually. But or the rail, a bigger rail announcement. I mean, I raised it in my question, but it wasn't raised by the Secretary of State about the environmental aspects of improving our rail network. Why isn't more of that happening?
I think it's a fair critique. We don't always take the opportunities to see the links between these things, and certainly not to draw them out in public announcements. They exist. For transport, obviously, the most obvious examples are around road transport and all the efforts being made on electric vehicles, charging infrastructure and so forth. But you're right, in quite a lot of cases, we could possibly, in communication, do more to show the links, show the opportunities across all of the different parts of government. So I just take the criticism.
Yeah. I mean, what's behind the question is, what's your responsibility in this? And do you accept the premise that ultimately you have a responsibility for?
From a clean power point of view, I think our responsibility is to make sure that we're doing it the other way. That we're making sure that when we are showing the opportunities of clean power for other types of infrastructure, for other parts of government, so we take action on this, then we drive down costs. We avoid the risk of fossil fuel price spikes, which could otherwise make things very difficult for other parts of government and its objectives. So I think we can absolutely do more to highlight the benefits of the clean power agenda for other parts of government. It's harder to speak for what I could do to get other parts of government to talk about us, although we'll have a good go.
I think we do all right on this. I mean, listen, I think it'd be really good if DFT had referred to the energy transition in there, but government's incredibly complex. My experience coming back into government, having been on the edge of it, is just how complex it is, and we do our best on this. But on the clean power, given the prominence of the clean power mission, something the Prime Minister speaks about, something the Chancellor speaks about, we do well, and it does matter. And I want to make the point that it's remarkable how much it matters. I think one of the very best things that happened to us on the Clean Power Mission was inviting the Prime Minister to come and see us early on, because it was very obvious to other parts of Whitehall the importance he was attaching to it then. And now we're still living off that. So the Office for Investment, for example, really important part of government that welcomes investment to this country. It's one of the key things that they talk about with those investors. That sort of stuff does matter. Yeah. And I'm certain there's more that we can do on this, and I on the edge of government in my previous role, I used to regularly think that there is more that the government could do to talk about the very good things that it's doing in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I know I shouldn't believe everything I read in the media, but there are plenty of media reports that there are people in Number 10 and elsewhere in government who are working against this agenda.
There are, I don't know them, and there is a. And I'm going to use the word scepticism. There's a scepticism about things that the department produces that it's quite right that they have it. So we get a lot of scrutiny from Number 10 and Treasury and other parts of Whitehall, which I welcome, frankly. And there isn't much evidence of us not succeeding in the things that we wanted to do. That we've done so by convincing other parts of Whitehall and government and industry that these are the right things to do. It's right that we're put through that test, frankly.
Thank you very much for your evidence and for staying with us this late.
Yeah. I'll see you in Grimsby.
Appreciate it. End of our session.